Hey everyone, welcome back to another session. Here I go, screwing this up right off the hop. Hey everybody, welcome to another session of the ILET Summit. This is in fact going to be the last session that we roll out for the entire event. So thank you for being here. If you're here with us live, or also if you're going to be watching this as a recorded video. Today's session, of course, is going to be on mental health and awareness, talking about resiliency, talking about post-traumatic stress, and all the different topics that come along with that. So thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a little bit of an interesting session that we have. Part of this is going to be my presentation to Copline, obviously, and talking about how much money we were able to raise over the course of the event for Copline and to support law enforcement mental health initiatives and support. And we're also going to be talking about a lot of different things that are coming up down the road. If you enjoyed the summit, I have some exciting news because there's going to be a lot more coming down the pipe for you. And then I'll give you some updates as to what's happening with the event. So before we go too far into things, I want to introduce our panel for today's discussion. Rather than have me go through and completely butcher your backgrounds and experiences and do you a disservice, what I'm going to do is, Robert, I'm going to start with you. Give your name, your background, and the organization that you're with, and kind of what you do on the day-to-day.
My name is Dr. Robert Perkins. I'm a psychophysiologist and professor of applied psychophysiology in Anaheim, California. Primarily, I work and I'm a retired law enforcement officer, 14 years, military veteran. Primarily, the work that I do is focused with the Ontario Critical Incident Stress Foundation and the California Practical Chaplain Association. In doing those things, it's training other individuals to work either in a chaplain role or in a peer support role to be able to provide sort of that mental first aid that many frontline law enforcement personnel need in order to be able to effectively process trauma and stress that they're going to encounter in their day-to-day life.
Before I forget, can you give us a quick overview of the new program that your college has developed for law enforcement?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the College of Certified Psychophysiologists has rolled out a new program. It's called a Certificate in Police Mental Wellness. And this is a program that was designed for a lay person to be able to get a lot of tools to put on their tool belt to be able to serve in a role as a peer support. So this includes things like critical incident stress debriefing certification. It includes things on understanding the sort of basic psychophysiology, anatomy and physiology of the body, different operational stress issues and whatnot. So what it's going to do is to be able to sort of supercharge that person that's on a peer support role to give them that sort of added dynamic, that added knowledge base to be able to be more effective in that position.
Awesome. And that's something I'm super excited. You and I have talked. I'm going to be going through that program myself and trying it out and getting all of the bits and pieces of knowledge. And so if you're interested in that specific program, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm sure in the notes on this video, we'll also have information so you can reach out to Dr. Perkins or to the College of Certified Psychophysiologists. Al, why don't you go next, my friend? It's early in the morning, very early in the morning for you, seeing as how you're all the way over in across the pond from us.
Absolutely, yeah. Hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Alec Mcgregor, and I kind of founded and run the company Inner Armor, and we focus on training police and military how to use a form of psychological coaching. So it's very intense and can be very painful and very difficult sometimes. The whole idea is to kind of get in there and train law enforcement how to use it with each other and to be able to coach each other through and out of stuff that's potentially going to get much bigger way down the line. So because we kind of sit halfway between a chat in a bar with a friend and a full-on clinical intervention. And often there's a needed clinical intervention, which is fantastic, and that's great and awesome. But there's this middle ground where we're really keen to kind of push that. So we've got some research papers coming out on what we're doing. Very important to make sure it's all kind of signed and sealed. But we're seeing tremendous traction, particularly with the Royal Marines here, the US Marines, and all our work's focused in North Carolina at the moment in the US, which I'm really passionate about. So I'm not a cop. I've done a lot of shifts with them. I like not being a cop. You guys are weird. Yeah, my kind of background is did a master's degree in positive psychology and just got the academia bug, but was constantly like, how can we refine this and get it sharp enough that it sticks in people's heads and they can use it? You know, that kind of phrase, everyone has a strategy until you're punched in the face. You know, how can you hold that and kind of take that with you? So ours is one tool. It's this 28 question coaching methodology. And we're busy, you know, developing it and scaling it. And it's just amazing to see so many people driving so much and so many professors and doctors pushing the same spearhead towards well-being and the kind of the good stuff. So, yeah.
One of the things that I love about your program is it's something that we don't do a lot of in police training or anything like that. It's the preemptive approach. It's being proactive in preventing these things from happening before it goes down, you know, before it gets to a point where you need that clinical intervention. It's let's address this beforehand. Let's give them the knowledge so that they can address and see the signs and symptoms as it happens. And that's something I'm super excited to talk about during this talk as well. And just so that people understand, your company and your program has actually been really wound into things like organizations like the Metropolitan Police Service, a lot of other agencies in the UK, a lot of the military units. And so that's really, really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it has. And it's that kind of preventative space. And I think we all get hung up and, you know, my learned friends here, you know, in kind of psychology and stuff, will know this, but, you know, so many times it's an afterthought and it's a really bad thing. People are very frightened of it. You know, if you go down the psychology route, people lose their badge, people, you know, it's attached to a lot of bad stuff. And for me, positive psychology was really exciting when I kind of picked it up 10 years ago and looked at it as it's the good in the dark. So it's the really light, powerful, good stuff, but you're taking it to such a dark place. And so it seems to be working really well. And it just blows my mind how we send these people, or you guys pretty much, we send law enforcement and military into the darkest spaces with very, very little, you know, kind of before they go. And there's a lot of stuff like during and there's a lot of stuff afterwards. But that's kind of where we sit, you know, and we're not good at the clinical. We don't do that. And yeah.
Awesome. And Stephanie, last but certainly not least, thank you for being here. We've been collaborating for a while since the summit began, and I reached out and said, I want to help you guys what you're doing because I love Copline. I love the story behind it, and I love the way that you actually help law enforcement. So can you give us a little bit about yourself and about Copline and what's going on right now?
Sure. My name is Stephanie Simons. I am the founder and director of Copline, but I think kind of what's important is that I am a practicing psychotherapist that treats, I'd say, 98% law enforcement, sprinkle of firefighters, and families for first responders. So Copline, I did Copline 15 years ago, incorporated it, and absolutely knew what the vision, the mission was. There had been it had been important to me that the integrity of these lines was always going to hold. And you kind of realize that the only way to do that is to hold it as a not-for-profit, to hold it so that not taking any government money. So we have no federal funds, we have no state funds. And part of that really just has to do with our own hypervigilance of wanting to be able to make sure that some of the questions that are asked on grants, and again, it's certainly a government, anybody that gives you money has every right in the world to ask you for information. We just wanted to make sure that the integrity of these lines was always going to be maintained. So unlike other hotlines, we are what we refer to as a non-rescue line. And having said that, I think it's really important to understand what a rescue line or a non-rescue line is. By no means are we saying that if an officer calls and is thinking about killing himself, are we not going to get help? But here's what we do know, and I think facts are important, you know, and we hear, you know, all the all the assumptions that go along with, if an officer ever talks to a therapist, they're going to lose their badge, they're going to lose their ability to continue to perform the duties of a police officer. That is not the case, but that is not really what Copline is about. But with the hypervigilance going in, we absolutely knew how it had to be set up. So what we know factually is that the oldest hotline in the country, and it's a suicide hotline. And again, Copline is not a suicide line. It is dealing with all the different psychosocial stressors, because we believe, and we have seen with these lines, that if we can grab them with low-hanging fruit, when there's higher hanging fruit, that they feel safe enough to call, which we have absolutely seen. But what we also know is that people that call hotlines don't typically die by suicide. So with the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is the oldest hotline in the country, is that they have fielded over 7,500,000 calls, of which 2 people have died by suicide on the lines. So what we know is, and that's a suicide line. And so what we know is that most people that call lines don't die by suicide. And more importantly, with law enforcement officers, they're talking to their own. And that's important to them. We have made sure the vetting process is extremely difficult. Kind of the easy lift is the first round is a pretty invasive questionnaire, which I always get questioned on. And, I had created it, but I'm looking for officers who are involved in critical incidents, their biases potentially about how they feel about medication, how they feel about therapists or what have you. So the questionnaire is pretty intense, but again, low lift. Now these retired officers have to go to a 40-hour training, their own cost, their own time, truly their own dime. And because we've got people nationally that come in from all over the country and Canada, that can be a sizable amount of money without the guarantee that they're ever going to answer the lines for us. So we are going into our 10th training. I can't even begin to tell you how helpful and how honored we are not only to participate in this summit, but to have been to be the recipient of the largesse that you've done, so that we can continue to train, because that is the number one cost of Copline, is the training. So when we pay our trainers, that is truly where the money goes. And we always say to people, we've got 990 forms, for God's sakes. If you ever want to look at where money goes, do that, because it's really important to see that nothing's padded. Nobody's going out for these meals or what have you. It's truly going to the population that absolutely needs to be served and deserves to be served. So we do it with the integrity that they deserve, that they look for. Our retired officers, so we're going into the 10th training. We've only had 3 where everybody ended up being vetted through and ended up on the lines. And there are some of those retirees that just kind of realized that it just wasn't for them. And I think the part of that it isn't for them is it ends up bringing up a lot of stuff that retired officers in their retirement just don't want to have to deal with. And that's one of the things that we vet through, and one of the struggles that we find. And we really want to be able to have a retiree on the end of a line that no matter what is going on with that law enforcement officer, active, retired, or their loved ones, that they are able to be heard, that they are not judged, and that they are never alone, whether they're on the phone for a minute, whether they're on the phone for 3 hours, that is really, really important. And when I was talking about a non-rescue line, we will not ping the phone. We will not do what a lot of we don't trace the calls. That is something that is just really, really important, because what we know with law enforcement is if we ping your phone and if we trace a call, who's coming to your house? Another officer. The good of the one cannot outweigh the good of the many. We have statistics that show that the person that's reaching out is not lethal. They are typically ambivalent about their lethality, should it be a lethal call. And our retirees are well trained to take that call for a positive outcome. And I'm happy to tell you that we have had quite a few, and the outcomes have been absolutely beautiful for everybody. So
that's awesome. And I mean, just so everyone understands, the reason why I chose Copline in the first place, it was actually because a friend of mine, Michael Sugru, actually, when we did a podcast together, he said, "Hey, have you heard of Copline?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "You should check them out." And I was like, "All right, I will." And here we are. So one of the coolest things that I thought when I researched it and I did my deep dive into Copline was the fact that you have retired officers answering the phone for officers that are in crisis or need help. Now, for me, and I think it's important that we share personal stories so that people understand. So for myself, I was never a police officer. I was an infantry officer in the Canadian Forces. When I was injured, I ended up having a severe spine injury, and I ended up in rehab and all these types of things. I ended up having to release. When I released, I went through a very rigorous process through medicals and all these things, psychological evaluations. And then I ended up going into some type of therapy or treatment where I spoke with a counselor upon my release. That was difficult for me. And it was difficult because I bounced between probably 7 or 8 counselors. And the majority of the counselors that I spoke with had never spent a minute in uniform. And so when I went to them, it was almost like I had to explain what my job was and what I did before I could just talk about what I was feeling. That was the hardest part. And I think that's what drew me so much to Copline was the fact that I pick up the phone and I call somebody. I know I'm speaking to somebody who I know has at least been in my shoes or has worn the uniform, has worn the badge, has walked the beat. That is so important. And that was the biggest drawing factor for me. It's a huge bonus that you guys are completely autonomous and that, like you said, you don't trace calls, you don't release data, you don't have to share anything with anybody. It's literally your integral unit, and people know that there's that confidentiality there, which I also think is very important, especially for law enforcement and also with the military, right? I mean, I had a gentleman by the name of David Rutherford on, former Navy SEAL, and we talked about how in the Special Forces world, they don't report TBI. So, and the reason being is because as soon as they do that, and there's that chink in the armor, there's a chance that they're going to get pulled from the teams and they're never going to be able to go back again. And I think that's a real fear for our officers is they think that if they report these things or if it's found out that they have these issues, that there's a chance that they're either going to get pulled, they're going to get stuck on a desk, or at the very worst, end up getting removed from the agency altogether. So anyways, that's really cool. And I'm excited about this panel because we have such an international experience on this. And before we get into things too far, I want to let everybody know if you're watching this live, there's a chat in whether you're watching this on Facebook, on YouTube. Make sure to ask any questions. These experts are here for you. So if you have any questions about PTSD, about mental health, about programs that are available, I know actually James Alvarez from Copline is also in the chat. So if you have any questions, he'll be able to get back to you real quickly on that. And we'll also bring your questions up for these experts here. So please make sure to do that. And I guess before we jump too far into things, why don't we do the actual announcement here on or my official presentation of what we ended up raising for Copline with the ILET Summit. So without any further ado, I can't obviously, I was joking with Stephanie before this, so you guys are aware, I can't obviously be there to give her a giant cardboard check. Check, crazy, which would be the coolest thing. But what we did do was a little bit of a video for everybody here. So just 2 seconds, and I'm going to pull this up. Boom. Yes. How was that for fancy? That was awesome. So we ended up raising over $15,500 for Copline and that's obviously US funds. So that's like 97,000 Canadian right now, or whatever that, whatever that ends up being. So Stephanie, it's honestly my honor and privilege to be able to present that to Copline, and hopefully that'll help support what you guys are doing and get some more of these trainings done. And that's really, that's not from me. That's from every officer that jumped on to the summit and supported what we were doing, which in turn allowed us to support what you guys are doing. So I hopefully that helps. And thank you for being a part of what we're doing.
Everybody, because it's not just you that believed in us, it's everybody else, and being able to get the word out there has been invaluable. You know, I become this face. I am a pimple on a gnat's ass when it comes to Copline. Truly, that's how I feel. I always have the light lift. You know, we've got 90, close to 90 volunteers right now that every day, 365 days a year, are making sure our lines are answered. They're doing additional trainings to make sure that they're staying up on what's going on in the country, on what Copline's putting out there. It's just, when it says, you know, that adage of it takes a village, it truly is amazing. My board is amazing. You know, Jim Alvarez, incredible. Francis Graff, there's nobody. Everybody just has a part in this, and everybody here has a part in this. And I'm honored. I'm honored to be the recipient, and would love to continue to be a part, and want everybody that's listening and that's part of this summit to be a part. This is yours. This isn't ours. This belongs to all of you. And the other thing that I wanted to also kind of piggyback on, which I think is really relevant, is that one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is vetting competently, culturally competent therapists. Because if that caller wants to speak to a therapist, we need to make sure that we're sending them to somebody where you're not spending, you know, your first 3 weeks, you know, kind of educating them on what your job is. So that's the other part. So truly, you know, being able to get as many resources, as much information, be able to look at the other countries and to say, Copline will always be available to work with any country. And again, under the same auspice. It's not about funding it, because we're not going to fund it with government money. How can we, as a community, continue to help in whatever country it is, so that any officer or their loved ones can have a safe place where they can just talk to somebody who gets it. So thank you. Thank you for helping us continue the mission and serve a population that is just so worthy of giving.
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure. You know, it was really cool to see and the support that was brought in. Obviously, with the summit, we had a lot of there was a lot of sessions that we had that were devoted to mental health and resiliency and awareness. Obviously, Dr. Perkins did an amazing session. We had Jeff Tinnen from CTP. Obviously, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman is awesome as always. And actually, as a matter of fact, just today, Dave sent me. So if you guys had watched Dave's presentation and you understand who Dave Grossman is, in his session, he actually didn't. He was like, we're not using PowerPoints. Literally everything he did was on boards in the back that he wrote on with a marker, right? So he actually took all of the things that he wrote and he signed them and he sent them to me. So what we're going to do is I have a handful of these. So what we're going to do on this live call is we're going to do some type of auction. I don't know how we're going to do it, but I want to do some type of auction, and we'll auction these off, and we'll add that total to what we're going to give to Copline as well. So you'll get an autographed one of these things from Dave Grossman's session, and I'll send those off to you. So give me a minute. I'm going to have to think about that as our speakers are going through what we're talking about today. And in a probably an hour or so, once I figure out how I'm going to do it, I'll let everybody know. So, all right, let's jump into it. Let's start talking about mental health. There's so many topics it's almost more difficult to start the conversation than once we get into it, because we can start so many places. I think the biggest thing right now on the top of people's minds is with what's happening to law enforcement, especially in the United States, and up here in Canada as well, and in the UK as well, right? I mean, what's happened, what started here, well, or not here, but what started in the United States has spread internationally. When I speak to officers and agencies in Australia, in New Zealand, in South America, even in Brazil, I spoke to a commander down there. Obviously in the UK, in Canada, it's everywhere. And officers are in the middle of it. The support level for law enforcement is probably as low as I've ever seen it, in my generation, anyways. What toll does that take on our officers right now? Are we at a significant risk for officers taking their own lives, or is there a significant mental health risk that we're facing right now because of what's happening? I'll let anybody take that one if you want.
I'll touch it. I'll touch it both personally and professionally in private practice, and I'll touch it internationally from what we're seeing on the lines. I'd been asked quite some time ago when COVID hit whether or not we saw an uptick in calls from COVID, and we're just not bullshitters. The answer was no. We didn't see any real significant uptick. I just believe cops have been fighting an invisible enemy forever. COVID was another part of that. But the key to that was they were respected, they were honored, they were able to do their job. Overnight, that changed. I don't know one cop that ever could wrap their head around not being disliked, becoming the enemy. That's what we're seeing, and I'm seeing in private practice as well, is what happened? Where was it that not only there is, they are now being called racist, they are now, every cop is a dirty cop, where they have to worry about going out to have something to eat, that somebody has poisoned them. That not only had we seen some of that going on, but now we're starting to see the hesitation in using deadly force when it is absolutely warranted. So that I have officers that are saying in private practice that they rather take a round than ever have to use a weapon. Now, they're trained to muscle memory. You guys know this certainly better than I do. Do I believe they'll take a round? I'm seeing the hesitation. I don't think they'll take the round. But my officers in general have never looked at color. They look at circumstances. They look at gun. I lectured in somebody, there's a spirited debate about this. And I said, I've now at this point in time really dealt with hundreds of shootings. And the only thing that the person has ever seen, typically when it's another firearm, is gun. That is it. And, and you realize during critical incidents, and you hyper focus, your vision becomes quite acute. Your hearing normally, if you have a visual, your hearing normally becomes much duller, and vice versa if you don't have visual. But now what we're seeing on the lines is the same thing, is officers and family members. We had a spouse that called who was wondering, what is she supposed to do, because they were going to be publishing her home address. And she said, how do I keep my family safe when my husband's at work? So, dealing with that, dealing with the officers that are just so disheartened, truly disheartened, and yet they are not calling out sick. They are not, in general, doing anything other than their jobs under some of the most difficult circumstances, certainly that I've seen in my lifetime. So I don't know what everybody else is seeing, but that's kind of what we're looking at, both, like I said, in private practice as well as on these lines.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you're saying. And I think that, the general public has to understand a few things. And, for the most part, cops are colorblind. They don't react to situations based on color. They react to situations based on observations of behavior. If a person is a non-compliant, they're acting in an aggressive manner, whether or not they have a weapon or the perception as a weapon, they are trained to react in a particular fashion, and that is regardless of color. But there's so many on a good day, and this is a conversation Adam and I have had in the past. On a good day, long before COVID, long before all of the sort of social issues that have presented themselves now, cops had a very difficult job, and now you put into this COVID-19, which early in April, when post-COVID traumatic stress syndrome was kind of put on the forefront. And, it was said, listen, these additional pressures, both on the civilian population and on our emergency services personnel, are going to cause an increase in, unruly activity. And you look at LA. I mean, I was going over some statistics with somebody from the LAPD today. I mean, from July until August, homicide rates are up 200% in Los Angeles. We've got rape up 96%. We've got all of these violent crimes because you've got a civilian population that they've been under a tremendous amount of stress. They've had to social self-isolate, and that brings within it all sort of pressures. And so we've got all of these things working, and then you combine that with the terrible thing that happened. But you've got a political constraint. You've got a very biased sort of media, and so it's very, very difficult. It's just like it's coming at them from every single angle. But in all my experiences, both in helping law enforcement and actively engaged as a law enforcement officer, I have never seen such a disregard and disrespect and hate. I mean, a hate. I watched a video in Portland this morning where they're basically saying murder a cop and save a life. Like this is out of control. And we look at police suicide rates, and we know that they're double the rest of the line of duty deaths. And I don't know what's going to happen this year because we've seen so many more line of duty deaths. How that's going to affect the sort of suicide of law enforcement officers, but they are under a tremendous amount of pressure for the finger is being pointed at them for a problem to which they did not create themselves.
Yeah, I think what both of you said is so spot on, and it's interesting with the kind of cop line point of view. I think Adam, you're kind of saying why is it kind of exploding and what's it doing to their heads and stuff, and I think. We all talk to ourselves. We all got that kind of reticular activating system, or kind of, right now, everyone on the call is like, am I talking to myself? Am I really? Is this okay? Who is this guy? Why does he sound weird? What's happening? And then, we've got this negativity bias anyway. Barbara Fredrickson talks about this kind of 3-1. Bad's always going to win. It doesn't mean we should stop. And the good guys shouldn't stop and the good girls shouldn't stop. But it is powerful, and that's just normally. And to me, what I'm kind of seeing across from the kind of UK, and it's only North Carolina that I can talk about, because that's what I kind of know, I have seen and worked with, and we're in touch with. But this is attacking identity and pride, which I think is what's so frightening. And we're seeing it. We're seeing kind of hate cops spray painted in rural areas, quite kind of posh, affluent, well-to-do areas, which is a kind of a whole new ball game, as well as kind of in London and in the big cities. But yeah, this kind of attacking, what we were saying about the media, the kind of having quite a biased media, and each country's different, and there's different medias in different countries. But I completely agree with you, and I think the coming at the kind of self-talk, the tools that kind of look at developing positive self-talk, this is their time. Because that's super important. And I think kind of what we've talked about, law enforcement, talking to law enforcement, and Stephanie, the kind of cop line stuff, absolutely. In our kind of coaching stuff, it's a lot more intense and in depth, that kind of from a psychology point of view. But I think you take someone's identity away from them, You know, and like, you know, if your identity is a cop, that's what you do. You know, that's who you are. You know, what you do. My name is X, and this is what I do, and I'm willing to die for you. You know, and you don't get that in very many professions. And all of a sudden, that kind of being turned around, I think the kind of time for positive self-talk is so key, and they're looking for it. And you know, particularly in North Carolina, the kind of law enforcement that I'm talking to are looking for that positive self-talk, where you'd normally get the odd good call. And again, not talking from experience, just from kind of being out with them and seeing it and talking to them. There would be the one person who says, you know what, thanks for coming in and helping, or you've saved my life, thanks very much. And there seems to be a lot less of that. And I think that compounded over time, you know, just that's what's new, is the pride of kind of law enforcement seems to be kind of taking some hits. But, you know, I'm interested what people think on that.
And, you know, what's making things worse is the fact that under all of this stress, both the senior command, the police chiefs, the mayor, the cities, I mean, they are not supporting law enforcement officers. They are not supporting something that they have taken an oath in sort of keeping the peace, and they're letting people out of fear. Fear. Let me tell you something. You want to defund the police, and you think that there is social disorder now. Just envision what that would look like realistically. But yet, instead of hitting this on the forefront and having engaging these conversations, they're giving them the sort of misconception that, hey, you know what, that's not a bad idea. Let's abolish the police. Let's see what that looks like. And clearly they're doing this because they don't know what to do, and they're afraid to say and do the wrong thing. But one only has to look at Seattle and Portland to see how well that works.
There was a go ahead, Stephanie. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the complexity, and because you talk about the media, you know, you talk about defunding the police, and as you're saying it, I'm thinking to myself, you know, we're all in agreement here, and I'm sure the people watching it pretty much are in agreement. How do you get the information out? How do you really disseminate when we've got media and social media that really picks and chooses so carefully, you know, what they're willing to air at this point in time? I remember lecturing at the FBI Academy years ago now, and over lunch, I was talking to one of the agents, and she was talking about Hollywood, and we were talking about what guns are used, you know, and kind of what research they do or whatever. And what came up, which fascinated me, was that if you ever want to see the #1 gun that is used in crimes during the year, look at the #1 movie from that year and the guns that were used. Where is the responsibility of the entertainment community when it comes to this, with this kind of knowledge? This is insanity to me. And yet they're the first ones. Everybody's defunding the police, except everybody has armed guards. Like what don't people get on this front? And with all of this going on, like I said, cops are still going out to work. They won't do the blue flu. They're not going to stay home because they will not accept that an innocent person could get hurt when they weren't there. That's not what they took their oath for. And how do you get that information out? And day after day, what they're fighting, and absolutely their mental health, you know, and you guys are spot on, you know, what we're seeing, you know, with them, and the psychological effects of all of this is taken.
You can't apply the litmus of logic to this situation, though. You look at everything that's happening. You look at people's reactions, and you say to yourself, how can people conduct themselves this way? There's no logical explanation, because if you just sort of entertain the fact, okay, let's take their point of view and let's see it to the end. What does that look like? What does it look like? It would be the pure anarchy, just pure chaos. And so when you don't apply logical application to the problems that are at hand, you're just fueling the fire. I mean, I watched today that there was a mayor in Minnesota that was arrested that was obviously anti-police and stopped while police officers were doing a vehicle stop, and he's filming them and he's using all of this foul language and says stop harassing people, things of that nature. This is what it's coming to. Now, what is it going to take? And absolutely, where do you get your information from? I mean, just because one particular candidate in the election says, I'm pro law enforcement, and if someone says, are you pro law enforcement? And I say, absolutely, then they automatically say, oh, well, you are a member of this political party. It's just gotten totally out of hand. But in the end, what is this doing? This is affecting the law enforcement officer from states and cities that had nothing to do with the mainstream events that's causing all of this social disorder. And, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I think, go on.
Go ahead, Al.
Nope.
Something, it's interesting what you said about illogical. Some of the kind of solutions and the kind of things that I've heard, and something that I've kind of adopted quite recently, where I think I was really wrong in the beginning. And the kind of adage of you put your own oxygen mask on before helping everybody else. I think we've got it wrong there. I think actually, when something's going wrong with your head and the people listening, and if you all kind of think about it, you're often the last one to know. It's your wife, it's your husband, it's your partner, it's your shift partner who'll say, are you all right? Because something's a bit off there. And I wonder if actually maybe the answer here is we've seen so much more community. I mean, look at this. This is incredible, and Adam, what you're doing and kind of pulling people together, and what you guys are saying, like almost choosing your news and choosing where it's happening. And maybe there's something in the idea of if everybody put the oxygen mask of their fellow officer to the left. So I look after, Steve, and I don't even worry about me. I just look after Steve. Steve looks after John. John looks after Jane, whoever. But that requires a real illogical thought process. And I wonder if maybe there's something in that. Maybe there's something in this kind of, you go into a bookshop and there's loads of, books on self-help. There's not a lot on helping others. And I wonder if actually maybe the selfishness that comes so naturally when people kind of take the oath and kind of go and do that, maybe that's it. And against that, you've got the kind of political stuff that's going on, which I'm just not going to comment on as a British person at all. I'm not qualified at all to go there. But I think phones as well is like, you guys are, all 25 years old. But I think pre-phones, I wonder what it was like, because in the Met here, the Met is the London Metropolitan Police Force, which is huge. It's 31,000 officers. And they've closed loads of police stations. And their big thing is they don't talk to each other because they're on their phones all the time, and then they're home to their families. So that kind of decompression, and I think, Stephanie, what you're doing is so fantastic with that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think maybe if there's something in this, if we can harness this unselfishness, and kind of that the tribe that is that bonds together and weathers the storm, and we all look after the person to our left. I don't know. I'm interested.
I kind of love that. I kind of love that thought of because law enforcement will absolutely look after their own, but being able to phrase it that way, kind of, the buddy system. In the military, you have your battle buddy. You can't go anywhere without your battle buddy. It is to literally have a battle buddy in law enforcement from the day you come on the job into the day you leave the job. What would that be like? But I think quite brilliant, actually, in thinking about that somebody that can call you, kind of that knows you well, that when you're more withdrawn, more in thought, missing work, we see so many different rudders that not until you have a suicide or some critical incident with that officer do you get that retrospect going, oh my God, I should have seen it, or what have you. I've always thought how important it is for agencies to monitor sick time, but I don't mean sick time that you jam them up. I mean, you've had a critical incident, and then particularly after critical incidents, watching if they now are grabbing tons of overtime, which we also see, at least I see in my private practice, because they don't want to be They don't want anything to happen to anybody on the job, so they need to be there, or they start banging out. Like, those are so important for people to really give a shit about and look at. So, yeah, just brilliantly put.
There's a comment here from Dr. Black. He said, we can make a choice to be logical, take care of our own, choose logic or polarization, set the example within our own culture, let alone those we serve. He actually also asked a question a little bit earlier, and he said, could investment in resilience, now knowing the times we are in and the times that will come, build a less polarized law enforcement officer of the future? So I guess that's a good place to start the discussion on. We know that things have changed pretty much irreparably for law enforcement. I don't think we're going to be going back to the way things were 6 months ago. So it begs the question, where are we headed now? Right? What's that next step? I know Robert and I have had a lot of discussions, online, offline, about critical incidents, talking about, if something happens, we talk all the time about in tactical medicine and in first aid, we talk about self-check, buddy check, and we don't do that from the psychological perspective, right? You're an officer involved shooting. You check yourself for wounds, make sure that you weren't hit or something that you didn't realize. You check your buddy, check their vest, make sure that, give them pat down, make sure you don't see any blood anywhere, make sure they're good. And then it's like, all right, let's spin back up and on to the next and deal with whatever we have to do because of that shooting. There isn't that psychological check. And it's like, hey man, how are you doing? Like, are you good? Like that isn't something. Some organizations are very proactive. I won't say that there aren't organizations, because there are a lot. I know in Lubbock, Texas, for example, they have Dr. Andy Young down there, who's one of their negotiators. They're very proactive at taking care of that psychological component, because they have somebody like Andy there to help them out through that process. But for agencies, we have, I think it's over 7,700 agencies in the U.S. And I mean, so many around the world that have very limited resources when it comes to these types of things. This is for them. This knowledge and this session is for them. So we can share that knowledge and they can take it and run with it. What is it that we can start doing from an individual officer perspective? Because let's not talk about the agencies yet, because we're talking policy, we're talking budgets, we're talking a lot of other things. From an individual officer perspective, what is it that they should know so that they can take care of themselves and their partners better? Maybe Al, I'll start with you, and then we'll jump around.
Sometimes when a question's so created for some of the stuff you're doing, I was doing this today in a city, Liverpool, so where the Beatles came from. Talking to some cops today about that. And I'm going to introduce, some of you would have kind of come across this, but our argument is a little bit controversial on this, which is actually maybe the answer is to be less resilient. And I'll explain what I mean here. And to kind of everyone listening and stuff, you may have heard of this, you may have not. I hadn't for quite a long time until I did my kind of degree in it. Post-traumatic growth, which is this idea of, it was explained to me of, in this Japanese art of kintsukuroi, where you have a kind of bowl or a cup. I'm British, so we've got a cup everywhere, right? So if you might see yourself as this cup, the first time you're hit, the first time you see a death, first time you see something happens, the cup cracks and you see a crack. And I think in the West, UK, US, Australia, we mend it with super glue and we pretend it's okay. Now we all know this cup's broken. We don't really want to use it to put our coffee in, but we'll use it anyway. Then it happens again, and then you break again and again. And by the end of it, you end up with some super glue all around this kind of cup, and it looks fine, but it's going to crack and break. Now I think that's our a lot of, and I'm going to be quite almost kind of polarizing this just for illustration purposes. But I think resilient wise, we kind of cake it in cement and we're like, right, that's going to be tough now, so it definitely won't break. And it won't. Cops are made of iron. When they snap hard, and they are naturally kind of quite resilient. You have to be. However, Kinsokori and post-traumatic growth. It's a real thing, kind of Japanese thing, where the first time we had a crack, they mend it with gold lacquer. Of this idea of you're more valuable for being broken. You're more valuable for being broken. Like, and that I was like, hang on, there's really something in that. And actually, you know, what is rank in law enforcement? It's the amount of times you've been broken and recovered and grown. And you think, are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Obviously not. Are you the same person you were yesterday? Well, no. You know, you kind of biologically, you've got different cells, but I think mentally as well. You know, and by doing that and kind of just changing the frame of reference. So when you see something traumatic, you know, for example, you go to a critical incident or there's a, you know, I mean, let's get into it, you know, there's a dead child there. If almost immediately you're kind of like, right, what can I do in my life that's good or can grow from this? Now it's almost offensive. You think, how can I be so unempathetic to this child? And, you know, that's awful and kind of whatever. If you then go home and you hug your child and you stay up a little bit longer than you would do normally, and you read a bit more of a story to them, or you make a bit more of an effort at home, that to me is the essence of post-traumatic growth. And actually, we're pretty crap as a species. We haven't got armor, ironically. You know, we're flesh and blood. We're very sensitive, whether we like to admit it or not. And we've got the team, and that's really good. But actually, maybe embracing a bit more of this fragility, and kind of going, right, I'm going to break. Because if you don't break when you see a dead child, I think there's something wrong with you. You're too resilient. You know, you do need to kind of feel that. But there's that balance between that and completely falling apart and crying all the time and not being able to do your job. So yeah, anyone who's interested, if you just Google post-traumatic growth, there's loads of videos on it and academic articles and all kinds of stuff. But I'd say that's a really good nugget to take. And that kind of, it's called Kinsokori. It's a Japanese method of pottery. You're gonna have to read that to me, Adam. I can see it on my screen, but it's only kind of super little.
I agree with your principle. Is post-traumatic growth, is that a thing? Absolutely, it is. But I'm going to tell you, quite frankly, from being a 14-year officer, from seeing literally hundreds of dead people, children, and what have you, to bring that as sort of a preventative measure, or to tell an officer that is not going to fly. It's not going to hold water at all. One of the reasons for that is because, you know what, when I see that dead child, I have engaged both my mind and my physiological responses. I press the pause button because a civilian person that's put into a situation that police officers have to deal with on a normal basis, they will go overload. I mean, if you take a person that goes to a bad traffic accident and a person's arm is severed off and there's the blood is splurting everywhere, and the average civilian approaches this, their reactions are probably going to be, they're going to go into hysteria because they've never seen anything like that, or they may start to vomit because it's so. And so, you know, law enforcement officers, first responders, not to fire, EMS, all of these, is they have conditioned their body to be able to sort of repress the normal psychological and physiological responses of the body that a civilian person would have to be able to deal with that situation. And when that happens, there is a process before that sort of person is going to reach their normal kind of homeostasis. So although I agree with what you said, yes, after a traumatic experience, when we have the opportunity to be able to reframe that experience, can that make that person a better person? Absolutely. But to suggest that when an officer sees a dead child that night when they go home, they won't be able to have that conversation with themselves, because they're still going to be coming down from having that pause button kind of like put on. And the other thing too is, I agree in principle with everything that you're saying. Unfortunately, if officers were to sort of embrace that and say, okay, you know what, I'm not as resilient as I am, and that gets communicated, they're going to be perceived both by senior command, both by their peers, as being weak. Because you have to change that culture of how we perceive law enforcement officers, because they're human beings like everybody else. And so, you know, if you get someone that says, hey, I'm gonna embrace this, and tomorrow when I go to work, I'm just going to do exactly what I heard. They're going to be in for quite a shock, because so we need to change the culture of how the general public perceives law enforcement officers, firefighters, and emergency services personnel. They're not Wonder Woman, they're not Superman, they are human beings, and everyone has a limited capacity of how much stress and how much trauma that they can take before they're going to break. And what we need to do is we need to put in things that are going to be able to measure what those capacities are. And again, what we said earlier, buddy system, absolutely. But we have to give them those tools to deal with the number one cause of death of police officers, which is suicide. It's the number one cause of death. We don't incorporate that into academy training. You know, it's just seen as a sideline.
It's some fantastic points. I think, yeah, I'll kind of just respond to kind of one or two. I think, yeah, I mean, the post-traumatic growth stuff as well, I think it takes time. You know, I think anyone who's ever been through anything traumatic, whatever your job is, you know, you work through it, and it does take time, and that kind of moves forward. Your thing about changing the whole culture, absolutely. But there's great bits of that. You want a cop to be resilient. You know, like someone kind of coming in to kind of deal with something, or kind of obviously, you know, that kind of needs to happen. It's a really interesting kind of pivot point, just to kind of look at, you know, if we go so tough, and you know that you start losing yourself, and lots of the kind of almost the kind of suicide stuff we've seen in North Carolina, and the kind of prevention of suicide and things that kind of come out of there, is they've lost the capacity to feel. Totally disengaging with my wife, just not me, but you know, some of the stuff you kind of hear, disengaging with their wives, so they're unable to access happiness, and it's a really dodgy word in some kind of ways. So I bizarrely, I think I agree with 100% of what you said, and I think, yeah, and this perception of weak is key, and I think we're probably a good 5 years away from, you know, getting our head around that. I think, you know, the fact that we're even having this conversation, you know, may not have been happening 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that's really fantastic. And yeah, I really don't want kind of people going away thinking, you know, I was saying like, yeah, you know, it's all going to be fine, and you know, experience something really traumatic, and then you can start going through that kind of process. It can be quite a very long process, but that trying to find
there's not one answer to the problem. It's a bit of this, a bit of that, and there has to be everybody that's a stakeholder in this. Say, listen, I've got something that's going to help. Let's bring it to the table. Let's embrace this. You know, and what Stephanie said earlier, you know, when it comes to law enforcement personnel that finally get the courage and the guts to be able to seek therapy, they've got to go somewhere that's going to understand not only what their job is, but the subculture that they work and live in, because it is not like the rest of the world. When you're a police officer, that's not a job. That is what you said, Al. It is your identity. It is your character. You eat, you sleep, you breathe that. And, you know, to go to a therapist that may be very, very well known, has a best-selling book entitled How Great a Therapist I Am, their therapy might not be towards traumatic stress. They might be a brilliant relationship therapist or something like that. So they have to not only have an understanding of operational stress and those sort of things that happen, but they have to have an understanding of the subculture to which these first responders work in. And without it, honestly, the therapy will be a waste of time, and it actually could be counterproductive.
Yeah, spot on. Absolutely.
Definitely let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Thanks. I want to touch on kind of that suicide awareness, and then go into the post-traumatic growth and resiliency. So years ago in the police academy, we actually, Monmouth County in New Jersey, we had been able to do 20 hours, which is crazy, on being able to train on post-traumatic stress and then suicide, depression, or what have you, of officers. And, you know, through time or what have you, through politics, through bullshit, you know, it just is kind of interesting to see kind of what gets talked about, what doesn't, and what have you. And I think it is imperative to be able to start at the beginning that makes talking to somebody normal and what they're going to see and what they see on the streets abnormal. So when you start talking about changing a culture, I think that's key. So that you've got to get into. So we've got the Police Training Commission. We've got and California has a different one. I know that TCOL is in Texas. So being able to really go after the trainings themselves and what's covered, and being able to do this self-care. I don't really think I think so many words get used, but being able to become comfortable asking an officer, are you thinking of killing yourself? I'm concerned. I know that you're going through, relationship issues seem to be at the top of the list of why officers are taking their lives. So we need to look at what is going on, and we need to be able to talk about it very openly, and not be concerned. And I think a lot of times why people avoid topics is because they don't want to upset them or they don't want to piss them off. I have asked the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? Truly countless times. I have never had an officer get so pissed off because I was wrong that they walked out and never came back. Absolutely not. But what I have had is an officer that is absolutely relieved that I am able to talk about that without them being concerned about what comes next. So being able to have that culturally competent therapist, to be able to have a hotline where you can discuss it, to be able to truly get into academies and be able to train how to talk, how to look at everybody, your profile and what's going on in the streets, is, as you said, this isn't a career. This is a way of life. This is how they see the world. I'm in a car with them. They see 10 different things than I saw on the street. That's who they are. Well, now they need to be able to do that with somebody else, somebody they love. And then they need to be able to articulate that. So that certainly, I'm a huge advocate, have been for decades, on being able to get into the academies and start appropriately teaching it. And then the other part of it is post-traumatic growth. So some years ago, post-traumatic growth was kind of described a little differently. So I'm going to check that out with you because it could be wrong, but it is kind of the example that was given was you have these people living in California on the San Andreas Fault. They've had a lovely life. They have a beautiful home. And all of a sudden, there's an 8.9 earthquake. Takes out everything. There was nothing in there that prepared them to lose that. Now, don't get me wrong. They certainly knew that they were living on the San Andreas Fault, but kind of that plausible deniability. This hasn't happened forever. It's not going to happen. That they don't have anything to pull from. Whereas the officer that lives down the street, he's got water, he's got MREs from the military. He has been waiting his entire adult life to be able to kind of get in there and help. So the difference between post-traumatic growth and resiliency to me has been that the officers have typically been exposed to so many traumatic events that they have built this resiliency. Whereas those that haven't can only experience the post-traumatic growth afterwards. And I think that's pretty much what you were saying. But I want to go on something else that, and this doesn't get talked about a whole lot, is truly the profile of a cop. And the profile of a cop looks like this. Somebody who has grown up in crisis, does well in crisis, doesn't know how to live without crisis. Somebody who has issues with a father figure or significant loss early in life. Somebody who has history of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, or neglect. Makes for a great cop, makes for a very difficult home life. But with that profile, they are coming on the job resilient. They have been able to figure out how to survive in what has been an insidious world before they ever took that oath. And they do well. They do well until they don't do well. So as a clinician, I will tell you that, so statistics are nationwide. 1 out of 3 females are molested, 1 out of 7 males. My practice sees those numbers halved. So being able to really look at trauma, being able to really kind of look at where you began and truly to use that for one's own mental health and to build from it, much like you're talking about with law enforcement, being able to use that after you've got on the job. Now to deal with it, what happens when that profile exists prior to. So I just wanted to open that up as well. Your mic's off.
I muted myself. All right. It's okay. I'll do this a few times yet. Don't worry. I wanted to jump in here real quick because I love this discussion. I love the fact that everyone's bringing a different point of view. And so I want to give my perspective of everything that the three of you have said, because maybe it'll be different, but I really want to tie it together. So what I'm hearing is a few different things. One is kind of that holistic approach to what we need to be training officers from the very beginning. And when I say holistic, I mean WHOLE, not we're not talking religion. I always have to clarify that because some people have an issue. So a holistic approach to this mental resiliency. And Stephanie, I don't mean to completely argue with you about your or to come up with a counterpoint to the type of officer that there is. But I can speak for personal experience that I know officers, especially up here in Canada, that have literally gone through a very easy life in that they come from complete homes. They have almost zero incidences of abuse, or actually to the point where when they go through their post-secondary and now they're 22, 24 years old and have never been in a fight in their life. They've never had somebody physically grab them or yell at them or anything, which is a whole nother issue that we find with law enforcement, is that they're not prepared. They have, when we talk about having that resiliency and that armor, they got none of it. They got, it's nothing. And so I think you really see two parts of the spectrum. You see those, and I think that's why life experience is so valued from law enforcement recruiters, that 28 to 35-year-old person who comes in, who has that life experience, who has been fired from jobs, who's been in fights, who has maybe been on a light side of an interaction with law enforcement on the wrong side or whatever it is, because they have some life experience and some of that resiliency built in them. But we're now at an academy level, we're dealing with people throughout the spectrum. So when we talk about this holistic approach, I love what both Robert and Al said, and I think they tie together in that I think we need to let officers know, like, this is what you need to expect coming into this job. I tell this story, it's kind of funny, and I'll probably get another negative review from this person, but when I started my podcast, the Tactical Breakdown podcast, I was about 3 or 4 months in, and I got an email from somebody who had been listening, and they said, I love your show, yada, yada, yada. Would you mind not swearing on the podcast? And I was like, okay. I was like, so I reached out to them. I was like, hey, really appreciate you reaching out. Can I, tell me a bit about yourself. What episode was this? And yada, yada. And they said, well, I'm an 18-year-old and I'm really looking forward and I'm thinking about a career in law enforcement. So I had to have a very real discussion with this gentleman. And I said, hey man, listen, if listening to some swear words in a podcast that are contextually based, because I'm literally in the podcast that he referenced, I was giving an example as to what a subject had said to an officer. And so that's very realistic. And if you're so sensitive that offends you that you don't want to hear it, you may want to consider another line of work. So That's a conversation. But the funny thing is that is the type of person that we're seeing gets through to the academy level because they meet every other criteria. Maybe they're an ace, maybe they're an academic stud, they're a college level athlete. They come from a great family, they have all the push behind them. Maybe they come from a law enforcement background, their family, but they have zero actual life experience built into them. And so giving them that knowledge and experience of, hey, listen, here's the realities of what you're going to face. And maybe having that discussion. I remember my first day of basic training in the military, they came in and they laid it out. They're like, this is going to suck. And if you're not ready for it, like, here you go speak to so-and-so, they'll sort you out. We'll have your flight home tomorrow. Because if you're not ready for this, we don't want you here. I think that's a real discussion that has to happen at recruit level for police academies is, hey, listen, here's the realities of this. Let's maybe do some of that exposure. Maybe show some photos or some videos of real life incidents, not to traumatize the person, but to get a real feel of where they're at and have that open and frank discussion. Like, listen, you may go through this episode and feel like you want to kill yourself because of all of these reasons or whatever it is. It's going to be a cumulative effect. This, I love the cup analogy. And I think, Robert, you have another analogy that we talked about with like a battery where you basically, you can only fill it so much, or there's so many things that you can experience before you cap out. Same thing with the cup. And I love the idea of the broken cup. But I agree with Robert in that going to an officer right off the hop and saying, well, I'm going to give you this tool. And then at the end of they have that bad event, they just go home and they're like, oh, maybe I can make this better. That transition could be immediate. I know we all know people that can literally flip that switch at the end of their shift, go home and be the most loving, caring parent you've ever seen. There's also those people that it takes them 3 to 6 months to get through that very narrow step from I experienced this, and then they have to go through that process to then be able to take it and see it as a positive. So I would love to discuss what that process looks like from the beginning at the academy level and what we need to be doing to roll that into all of our officers. I hope that makes sense. But
Adam, I couldn't agree with you more. And I have spent probably the better part of 16 years in Canada, in the province of Ontario, the last 24 months in California, working with various police academies in the state of California, saying, listen, you need this training. Suicide is the #1 cause of death. So we need to construct academy-based training so that officers understand this. And we're met with the same thing all of the time. Okay, well, you know what? We've crunched all the numbers. We've freed up 45 minutes. 45 minutes in their entire tenure at the police academy. I am pleased to say that 16 years I've been knocking on the door in Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, at the Ontario Police College, of the importance of critical incident stress debriefing. 16 years later, I finally got a welcome invitation where I had 2 of the senior instructors participate in a trauma intervention training program in critical incident stress debriefing that has an emphasis on teaching individuals how their bodies and minds react to trauma so that they don't think that they're broken when this happens. And finally, they are beginning to change in structure, first having it offered actually at the Ontario Police College as sort of a continuing education program, but looking at how that's going to look in incorporating that into basic training. So it's these type of things that are so crucial, because it's not going to happen. This aftercare is great, but many people that suffer from operational stress injuries, that doesn't rear its head until 6 months later, 6 years later, 30 years later, and all of a sudden that accumulated trauma is just come, and they don't know how to deal with it. So educating an individual on how their body works psychologically, physically, emotionally, so that when these things come, they go, look, I'm not broken. I tell people when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder, operational stress injury, and all of these things associated with stress and trauma, when this happens to them, it's like the check engine light comes on in the car. When your check engine light comes on, you don't get rid of the car. What is it? It's just an indication that something is not right and it needs some attention. So, this is what we need to do, number one. And number two, we need to accept psychological injury and give it the same place as physical injury. Officer gets shot in the leg by somebody, they don't expect him to hobble back to work the next day. Why? Because he incurred an injury, we can see it, and that injury would prevent him from being able to properly do his job. And until we accept, when I say we, I'm talking about police departments, I'm talking about workmen's comp branches, until they take mental injury and treat it the same as physical injury, this is still going to be a problem. And let me just say, I'll just close in saying that in the United States, you have 5 states that recognize post-traumatic stress disorder as a compensatable workman's comp injury. Like, that is just ludicrous.
Oh, Hasek stuff. Go ahead.
All right. So a couple of things. And again, the profile of a cop is not necessary. I mean, that is what I have seen, but I certainly have also seen what you're talking about, which is these guys are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and there was nothing that prepared them to experience what they experience. So I see almost a dichotomy of who goes on the job, and of course, with our military going on the job, those that have been involved in combat, we also see, kind of that life, those life experiences that are truly key to success. The workers' compensation issue, I want to piggyback. That is huge. I mean, very few people knew that when Sandy Hook hit, that those officers in Connecticut did not acknowledge a psychological injury. So now you're dealing with, officers having to use their sick time, their vacation time, and not being able to truly get the treatment that they needed to heal from a work-related injury. And then, I mean, New Jersey has, we do acknowledge a psychological injury as a valid workers' compensation claim. Our pension system does acknowledge that is a compensatable retirement issue as well. But the workers' compensation system is so flawed. It is so flawed. So it is not uncommon for workers' comp to find, I will give you a for instance. So I had an officer involved in a shooting with an EDP, emotionally disturbed person. The therapist that they sent them to treats schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia and bipolar. So when he goes into this office, he is literally flashing back from the second he starts. Asked the therapist whether or not she had ever treated a law enforcement officer, and her response was, no, but you've never been involved in a shooting, so we can both learn together. Where'd he go?
Somewhere else.
So it's just, so there's so many different layers to this onion. And then people question, why are officers taking their lives? Because you've tied their hands behind their backs and you just keep taking shots at them. And eventually it's the only way to stop the pain. And when you talk about the glass, and I love that vision, that visual as well. I know that I always talked about like the rain barrel, and not only, you don't know, everybody comes on the job with that rain barrel in a different place with it being, kind of drips in there as to being, possibly half full, whatever. It doesn't make a difference. Over the years or over time, that rain barrel spills. Now, even if you spill it out, one of the things that still exists is when you have moisture, you're going to end up with black mold. And nobody sees it. And that's the other part, is that we need to be able to be vigilant and be able to help educate them. I mean, I think that's really what so much of this is about, and how we do it. I think we can all kind of brainstorm. I think everybody would agree that, starting at the police academy with recruits is imperative. Being able to to kind of cover both physiologically what happens to you when you're involved in a critical incident, and and then psychologically. There's just so many components. But you're right, when you get 45 minutes, woohoo! I mean, it's just, it really sends a message to them. It's like when you only take the firearm, their duty weapon, but you leave all their personal weapons. And my thing has always been, if you're a licensed clinician, and there's a problem, we take all of the guns, whether they're safeguarded or what have you. But a department sends a message to somebody that says, well, because this is with a mental health issue. This is not having to do with a critical incident standard operating procedure. Many times, departments will only take a duty weapon, which says it's okay for you to kill yourself with your gun, but it's not okay for you to kill yourself with ours. So I think you need to start from the bottom up and the top down. I mean, I don't know kind of where you go.
Well, I think here's a good place to start, right? Having these open discussions and that's the key to this. And that's the biggest thing I love about the summit. And actually, just before I totally forget, to follow up with this whole thing, our friends at Complete Threat Preparedness are actually teaming up with us to host the National Emergency Responder Conference, which is going to take place later this year. And they've taken that full day and have dedicated towards mental health and resiliency. So that entire conference is going to be all about what we're talking about today with multiple experts. I think they're going to have breakout sessions, and we're going to do a lot of things with that, workshops and stuff for officers and people that are taking part. And that's not just for law enforcement. It'll be for first responders, EMS, fire, emergency management personnel, and so on and so forth. So, and dispatchers. I think here's another thing that I want to make sure that we touch on is we talk a lot about law enforcement. People tend to forget dispatch. And in my experience, in the people that I've spoken with, a lot of the times they have a lot harder of a job in dealing with things like this than an officer does, because, for example, they get called or they get a call in, say there's a person who's in trouble. Maybe somebody broken into their house, they're hiding under the bed. That dispatcher, once that call gets picked up by the police, that dispatcher's off the call. And a very high percentage of the time, they actually never get a resolution to that incident unless they actively go out and seek it, which from a psychological perspective has to be just horrible.
That's so true. And, when it comes to, for a few decades, when even police departments that had a good critical incident stress management strategy and was deploying these critical incident stress debriefing, they were leaving out a very integral part of that group, and that was dispatch. When an officer cries out for help or he gets hurt or there's a line of duty death, the first line of communication is to that dispatcher. And many times these dispatch centers are in the same buildings as where the police department operates. The dispatchers know the police officers, and likewise. And many times when there's a serious situation and that dispatcher has to take that call, before the issue has been resolved, that person has finished their shift and they go home not knowing what happened. And then they'll begin to question themselves. Did I hear everything? Did I do everything right? So including them as part of that, because the stress that's put on our dispatch is incredible. Every person that has a role in law enforcement, whether it's frontline, whether it's support, whether it's dispatch, incredible amount of stress, and literally lives are in the balance.
I want to jump back. Hang on a sec, Al. Sorry, I muted you there. I want to jump back real quick because Al, I want to give you the opportunity, and maybe it's just my experience, maybe it's just being a Canadian, I don't know. But I feel that from what I've seen in law enforcement training, anyways, is there's apt to change policies, procedures, and training to be a little bit more proactive. We lost Al. It happens more so in European law enforcement and Canadian law enforcement than it does to our counterparts in the US. And that's just my own personal experience. I could be wrong. But it seems like there's a lot of change that happens for European law enforcement agencies that doesn't happen in Canada or the US till later on. Like it could be days, weeks, years down the road until we start adopting things in North America. My question to you guys, since you know more than me, and this is just an outside opinion, is that something that you have seen? Am I on with that, or am I completely out to lunch? And if it is true, then why is it that European models tend to be more proactive and less reactive in what they're doing? So I wanted to give it to Al so that he could share a bit about what they're doing, and how their model really got built out in what they're doing, especially with the Met, because that is the largest law enforcement agency in Europe, I believe. So Al, I want to pass it off to you to share your thoughts on that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was disconnected for a tiny little bit of that. So if I'm missing a bit, let me know. I want to highlight the work, I think, of Essex. Essex is the kind of county that's next to London, and I'll start with the dispatch stuff. I'm going to highlight a guy. There's a guy called Nick Elliott, who is an inspector who took the approach. He was in charge of the call center, like our kind of 911 call center. So there's about 60 dispatchers looking after, X amount of calls. And he took it as almost as a HR thing, like a human resources thing. So if anyone had a problem, he would kind of take that as, right, what process led to that problem happening, and everything. Was there not enough coffee? Were there not enough support? But he approached it from a system point of view rather than a personal point of view. And I thought that was really good. I thought that was really seriously impressive. And I've seen it mirrored in the Nordic countries. So we spent a lot of time in Sweden. I didn't know very much about Sweden before we kind of got a call and they said, will you come out and do, what you do? And we said, yeah, totally. And that very different problems, but they are really keen on the kind of the proactive and the preventative and the really high accountability. So you have to go to university. You have to go to university and do a full-on degree to become a police officer. Now that's really contentious in the UK because you don't in the UK. And there's a lot of people saying, look, you don't need to be you don't need to be an academic to do this. I don't need to study this. I just need to do it. And I really like what Robert said. I think, there's kind of that experience of just get out and do it. Get out and do it and keep doing it. And that is almost the kind of growth from that. The accountability in the Nordic model is very high, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. People can kind of make up their own minds. What I was really interested in was there was a really distinct crossover in Sweden. It's a really good petri dish to share with people who some will know and some won't. It's unofficially where ISIS send their fighters to recover in the health system, because Sweden's borders are so lax, partly. So there's huge conversations about this. But the police find themselves dealing with really almost military-esque type issues and those kind of things. And the leadership and the culture and the structure there is very much, if an officer kills himself, their line manager could be going to prison. Because it will be, if you knew you could do something and you didn't do it, and I think it's a completely different approach to almost, I think, the idea of equipping with tools is fantastic. And that was almost kind of what my input was. I said, look, this is one tool we have. And I can't remember if Robert, you said this or Stephanie said this, but like, it's pulling them all together, in that full tool belt and, having the whole thing together. But the accountability thing was really, I still have mixed feelings about it. I'm still a bit like, I don't know if it works or if it not. But speaking to the people on the ground, they felt very much like, well, I feel cared for, because if I know I'm having a problem, not only is it kind of, there's no stigma, and I'm willing to talk about the kind of mental health of, straight up, but also I know that I also don't want to get my boss in trouble, so I'll talk about it twice. If he suggests go and talk to 3 people, then I'll go talk to 3 people. They've also, what I was impressed with is they've nailed that buddy system, which I thought was really interesting. That's a real out there kind of example. Does that answer your question, Adam? Or big interesting question?
Yeah, you know what? That is the most fascinating thing I think I've heard this entire summit, and I didn't know about that about Sweden, that their model is essentially, if an officer kills themselves, that their supervisor is held almost immediately accountable for that. And so that's really, really interesting in the fact that it kind of puts an extra onus on that officer when they're going through their process of, does it make sense to take my own life? What does that look like for my friends, for my family, and so on? But then they have to be like, there's a possibility that someone is going to be sent to prison if I do this. It kind of, it adds another full component to that. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, like you said. I'd love to get the thoughts from the other two here on the panel on that, because that seems crazy. I mean, it could be awesome, but it also seems like very, very radical almost in that type of thinking. So I'd love to get the thoughts of everybody.
Adam, there's a couple of things that are very, very true what you said. We're currently doing a study right now on the suicide rate of law enforcement officers that are on a canine unit. And what we mean by that is that, when an officer that's going to take his own life, if he's a canine officer, he would have bonded with that dog. There's going to be a process that says, well, who's going to look after my dog and this and that. Many times, especially with, and I do a lot of work with military personnel as well as frontline responders, it's not that the officer doesn't want to live. It's that they cannot continue to live with the level of trauma, with the level of pain, both at a psychological level and a physical level. They can't endure that, and so they choose to end that sort of pain. And there is also a theory about, especially when it comes to military personnel that suffer from PTSD, and they'll have these sort of outbursts of violence, and especially when weapons are in the home. The thought process of them is, what if I get a violent outbreak and I grab my weapon? I could harm my child, I could harm my spouse, I could harm my friends. And so it's almost like they're euthanizing themselves. But these are the things that we have to look at. We have to look at what it is that these people are reaching out to that is either successful or unsuccessful. And there are a lot of unsuccessful treatments for stress and trauma, especially for the military. I know in the United States, I mean, they're experimenting with everything from electric shock to giving people ecstasy. What does that say? It says that they don't know what to do. And so it's just, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They're just trying sort of everything. And then look at what the positive things are. Like, why is it that, people that participate in things like animal therapy, in things like yoga and meditation, why are these things positive? And unfortunately, these positive things that don't necessarily have a direct correlation to the prescription of pharmaceutical drugs or the endless therapy sessions or what have you that generate revenue for professional physicians and mental health workers and many organizations that claim to want to help these people. If you have something that doesn't bring them money, it doesn't get attention. And so we need to be able to generate attention to the things that are helping people, that are saving lives, whether or not they are making money for other people or not.
There's something that we've kind of segued into something else I wanted to talk about with all of this, and that is substance abuse. And substance abuse, both from the self-prescribed version of it to the professionally prescribed version of it. And I know a few of you have strong thoughts on those as well. So I'm going to preface this by giving my experience again, and then we can kind of take that as a jumping off point. When I left the military, obviously I left due to injury, so I had a pretty significant spine injury. It's still there. I'm no longer on medication, but when I was in, I mean, I was prescribed pretty much anything. I said, like, hey, I'm still feeling pain. It's like, okay, add this, and to the point where I didn't feel shit, and I'd be back in barracks. And I'd be sitting there and I'd feel a twinge and I'd be like, oh, you know what? And I'd get my buddies to roll out. They'd get me a 2-4 or 24 beer. And I would sit there and I'd drink beer, add that to the medication that I was currently taking, watch a movie, pass out, and rinse and repeat for 6 months. The problem was that I grew a dependency on the opiates that I was taking because of my injury. And not only that, and then the alcohol added a whole other component to that. So I found that when I left, I not only had to battle the kind of the addiction to the opiates, which was easier to kick. The harder part was the alcohol abuse that I was putting my body through because I just got used to that as a habit. And I was lucky that it wasn't a prolonged thing for me. And I had a lot of people who basically just gave me a swift kick in the ass, which set me kind of in the right path. And I was lucky that I was able to do that. There are a lot of people, military members, active and veteran, and a lot of law enforcement officers, both active and veteran, that aren't as lucky as I was, that basically spiraled down the rabbit hole because of either something that was self-prescribed or something that was professionally prescribed, in terms of like the strong opiates and things like that, and or other types of medication for depression and those types of things. So maybe Robert, maybe you want to take this one from me for this and kind of start this off.
For sure. You know, we know the average person knows very little about what the human body is capable of. And for basically every prescription drug that you could purchase in a drugstore, including opiates, the body has the ability to generate that naturally. But we live in North America. We live in a prescription drug culture. And when you mentioned about North Carolina, I lived in Jacksonville, North Carolina, at Camp Lejeune for almost a year, doing a lot of work with the Wounded Warrior Battalion. And some of the things these people would say, it's like, okay, you know what? I went to my therapist and they prescribed me this medication to ease my anxiety, but that wouldn't let me sleep. So then they gave me another medication to help me sleep, but that gave me headaches. So they gave me another medication to ease the headaches. But then I had erectile dysfunction. They gave me, and it went on and on and on and on. And so here's someone that's being treated for post-traumatic stress disorder. And these guys would show me literally a handful of pills they would have to take every single day. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Because of that is why we have a lack of progress in the successful treatment in curing people of these things, is because it's big business. So absolutely, Adam, I agree with you 100%. The problem is that when you get an individual that either has a injury, especially in the military, when you have people coming back, they're battling a physical injury, and they're prescribed medication for that, and then you combine it with all of these things. Our bodies were not designed to have that much pharmaceutical going through our system at the same time, and it just seems to be an easy fix for many doctors, and it's a Band-Aid solution, but it creates a very, very dangerous possibility of abuse, especially when you take those sort of things and then they're combined with non-prescribed drugs, or guess what? The prescription runs out, or the person's medical coverage runs out, and they want to be numb, because all of those medications have essentially numbed how they feel physically, but it's also numbing how they're feeling psychologically. A lot of these psychological and emotional things, they are very important. It is necessary for healing. Again, that check engine light coming on.
Yeah. We have a mutual friend in common, Terrence Kosker, who has a great. If you guys don't know Terrence, I got to get everybody. I wish he would have been on here. He's running a camp right now, and he's out in the middle of the wilderness in BC, so he's always hard to get a hold of. But he has an amazing story about that, because that's what happened with him. And so if you ever want to hear that, I did a fantastic episode with him on our podcast. Shameless pitch to my podcast, Tactical Breakdown. But I did a full episode with Terrence. And you can check that out as well. We'll make sure there's links to that for everybody. Stephanie, what are your thoughts on this topic?
So I got thoughts. So I certainly agree with what you guys are saying, but I think the opiates are probably the ones that are near and dear to my heart at this point in time. That it's my experience that most of the officers truly that end up addicted to opiates is so similar to how you did, which is line of duty, injury, and then are prescribed it. My biggest issue is how many first responder programs come up in this country, and the amount of true money that is made. And it was right after the Boston bombing. I had worked with Boston PD, and they had been given grant money. Then they worked with McLean to set up a first responder program. But it was the first time that I had a first responder program that was doing 2 weeks and not extended periods of time. And this drug Vivitrol was mentioned. Not a clue what Vivitrol was. Are you guys familiar with it? Adam, are you familiar with Vivitrol?
No.
No,
So,
I'm not.
So what was happening was, if I said, what's Narcan? I assume everybody knows what Narcan is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 100% opiate blocker. And it will put anybody who is using opiates into precipitated drug withdrawal. So the pill version of Narcan is naltrexone, and the injection version is Vivitrol, which means that it is a 100% opiate blocker. So what started really pissing me off was watching these guys go to Suboxone and watching these doctors, the Suboxone doctors making a fortune, them still being able to use the opiates, and so many deaths and so many loved ones thinking, what the hell could they have done? And I'm not going to disagree that it'd be great to truly use every other means besides medication. But when you are releasing these individuals from these rehabs that insurance companies have paid $30,000 for 30 days for, and their recidivism rate is as high as it is, how do you justify not telling anybody or the families about Vivitrol? I have watched truly such heartache from overdoses, such heartache that just could have been prevented. And, in New Jersey, we had introduced legislation about confidentiality issues. And it was interesting because I'll tell you who showed up to go up against the legislation was the insurance companies. And when they went after it, they did. I mean, they didn't go after the therapist as much because there's just not that much money to be made. It's going after the rehabs and this unprecedented amount of money that is being paid out. And I was actually wondering with Al what was going on in the UK and what they're seeing over there, because I have no insight there.
Yeah. For people kind of who don't know, who are listening, our healthcare is completely free. It's something called the National Health Service, which is incredible. You walk into hospital, you get what you need, whatever it is. It's prioritized on kind of triage basis. So if it's a heart attack, and that's it. It amazed me when I first kind of went to the States and went to Texas. So, and did an EMS round way before kind of in arm and kind of getting into this. And the idea that a widow could be left with their husband's bill, for kind of drugs and kind of all that stuff. But I think there's a sociological construct here, and I think it's a book, but don't quote me on that, as it's like 2:30 a.m. called The Symptom Society. And I think it's really pervasive, and a bit like Robert talking about the culture thing. We've come back full circle is right from when we started school. The idea of feeling uncomfortable or something being difficult or something being painful is just not okay. And you can almost kind of twin it and just go with me on this, and it might seem a bit off topic, but I will pull it back. Of everyone being number one, everyone being happy, comfortable, and number one. You go through school, everybody gets a prize. There's no losers as such, and if something feels uncomfortable, then that symptom that is often temporary is medicated. I don't mean necessarily medicated by drugs, but medicated perhaps by a hug, medicated by whatever. And this, prescribing drugs for kids, we started hearing about that was happening in the US. So if they start down that bandwagon, like we don't have necessarily big pharma reps and people selling stuff, and if you're on a certain drug and it's beginning to get out of hand, your particular doctor will pull you up and often kind of pull you in for a consultation or have a video consultation and say, look, you've had this for like 3 years now, you should have been off this by now, like what's going on? And they'll look at more the root cause. The problem is the patient walk out, so it's free. And the doctor say, I'm not going to give you any more pills. They're saying, well, I'm going to go private then. And you can opt in this if you pay privately, and then you pretty much dictate what you get. The doctors will kind of work with you, but you're kind of paying that. And it's, as listening to you, what you were saying and stuff, and it's the word that kind of springs to mind is criminal. It's kind of hold people to account and kind of a bit like you were saying, Robert, you know, I have a pill for this and a pill for that and a pill for that. And it hits home for me personally because my mum died from this. And she started off with a kind of quite a mild glandular fever. And 20 years later, she was on morphine. She was on more morphine, you know, and she was a nurse to kind of start with. And she lost her mind, and, you know, it was a horrible death and all the rest of it. And I have no doubt that was the kind of the pill culture. And when she couldn't get it, you know, she went private and she paid a lot of money and she got the drugs that she needed. So I'm not holding the UK as a shining light or anything, but it's this symptom society. I think the underlying sociological roots of this that we all grow up with are that it's not okay to be uncomfortable. And we want people to be happy. We want our kids to be happy. We want the world to be a happy place and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, but a degree of difficulty and trauma and that kind of stuff, you know, that's part of life, and that kind of comes with it. And if you medicate that out, you know, how does that work? And so listen to what you're saying about, you know, for the first option to kind of for companies to jump on that and be making creaming off the profits on that feels wrong. And then so that's where I'm
Adam, what he said is spot on, because, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's fashion or whether it's music. Europe has always, the UK has always been a year, sometimes 5 years ahead of North America. And I want to give you an example. You know, there's an amazing the medical system in France is amazing. I'm in California. I'm a surfer. I love to surf. And I have the privilege of participating in some really unique therapy modalities in treating Marines, and that's using surf therapy. So that's taking people that are suffering from PTSD, you know, and they'll be hyper vigilant. They have this aversion to adrenaline, so they avoid adrenaline at all costs, whether it's good or whether it's bad. But when you're able to take them down to the ocean in a controlled environment and teach them how to surf, that first time that they stand on that surfboard and they stand up, all of a sudden they start feeling like Marines again. And then their bodies and their mind are in a different place when they come to shore. And this is where we begin some of the reframings and the conversations. But here's an example. So France, believe it or not, up until about probably 4 or 5 years ago, they were the #1 person per capita consumer of pharmaceutical drugs. They even exceeded the United States. And so there was a doctor in France that saw this surf therapy that was really birthed in Santa Monica in California by someone by the name of Dr. Carly Rogers. And he put this forward to the government. You know, they embraced that so much that now if you suffer from stress, whether it's post-traumatic stress or you got in a car accident, instead of being prescribed prescription drugs, their government health care and their private health care will pay for you to take surfing lessons. It pays for your wetsuit. It pays for all of these things. And they're seeing an enormous amount of success in the treatment of this individual and a decrease in their population taking pharmaceutical drugs. So yes, so many things in Europe. We could learn a lot because they'll take these sort of out-of-the-box steps because they'll realize that. And they're not as tied monetarily to big pharma as we find ourselves in North America.
You know what? It's really interesting. And Robert, you and I talked about this actually when you were on the podcast. And maybe if you're listening to this and you're in America, you don't understand. But in most other developed countries, pharmaceutical ads are banned. So like we actually have laws that pharmaceutical companies cannot advertise on TV. And I'm pretty sure it's the exact same in the UK. Al would maybe back me up on that one.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So it's really interesting because it's funny as a Canadian, every time we watch American sporting events or we're watching something on American television off a station, and then we get all these pharmaceutical ads. It's the only time we ever get exposure to them. Which it's going back to all this kind of stuff that you were talking about is why it's so prevalent. You know, we don't talk about that physical like when we talk about depression, I mean, there's so much research out there that shows physical activity combats depression almost better than any type of pharmaceutical drug. But that's not being pushed because the doctor doesn't make any money from the pharmaceutical.
Exactly.
If he doesn't say, if all he says is all you need to do is buy a pair of fucking running shoes and go for a run versus here, let me prescribe you something that you're going to take over the next 16 years that your insurance will cover. Don't worry about it. And go that route. And not to mention, we have a very lazy culture in general, more so in North America, I would say, but a lazy culture in that if somebody can take the quick way out and pop a pill versus strapping on shoes and battling through a run every day, they want to take the quick way out, which I think is also something that can be ingrained from an academy level, going back to the police academy. And that's something that they do very well, whether you're in military and law enforcement, is building up that physical training, and the exposure to physical training happens all the time. The problem is that the second that you're out of the academy, there's no drill instructor telling you, let's go for a run at 5 a.m. It's on your own. And you see a drastic drop in the amount of physical training that somebody does on their own, unless they're one of those like hyper athletes or whatever it is. So a few interesting talking points there, but very interesting in general.
Yeah, sometimes it is the easy way out. Can you imagine this, Adam? Imagine if you were a medical doctor or you were a mental health professional and you had to track your batting average for the year. So that's people that came to you with the problem. Did you solve it? Did the problem go down this much of a percentage? And in order to renew your license every year, you had to have a batting average of about like 75, 80%. Imagine how many licenses wouldn't be renewed.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy. Anybody else have thoughts on this? No? Nobody? Oh, awesome. All right, sweet then. So one thing that I do want to bring up, obviously, is, again, if you have any questions and you're watching this, please feel free to add them in the chat. These guys here are willing to answer any questions that you have. I'm more than happy to help you out there. I guess where's the next step from here? We've talked about we need to start at the academy level. We need to take a holistic approach at training these officers. We've talked about addiction. When we talk about mental health in general for law enforcement, what are we missing? Like, we're missing something, and what is it?
I think relationship issues are also kind of key, is interpersonal relationships, communication. With relationships being so significant in law enforcement, with the divorce rates being what they are, I kind of think that something's missing in that arena.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that there's someone in the United States, his name was Ron Clark. He's the former director of Badge of Life in the United States. And for so many years, when they would do these conferences, he would put forth this suggestion. So many police departments, both in Canada and the United States, you have to do a physical fitness test every single year. And that's only something that they've deployed recently, but it keeps you in physical shape. That makes sense. He was suggesting that, you know what, we need a mental health check-in once a year. It's not like you're going to have an in-depth sort of testing, but it's sort of just a mental health check-in where you're going to be with a person that's going to be able to sort of measure. And it's like, taking your car to the garage, they hook up the diagnostic thing, and then if there's a problem, until we're as proactive as we are reactive and change the culture and get buy-in from all of the stakeholders, that is really what is required. Because to do only one thing and not all of those things collectively, again, we're just putting band-aids on. We really need to make dynamic structural changes in order to really make a big difference in this area.
But the issue that comes up is, because this has been the debate, is, okay, so you send the officer in for that once a year checkup from the neck up, and they find that they are struggling with something. Now what? Now what happens if they can't go to work? Who covers them? How do they get treatment? Who pays for the treatment? How do they get back? Who knows? It is great on the surface, but once you start going underneath that surface, surface, I see it being a huge, huge issue.
If it's done by the department, and then don't do it at all. But what I'm saying is, okay, we don't do it. And guess what? That officer doesn't have that check-in, gets overwhelmed by traumatic stress, kills himself, or it comes out in a use of force issue. So I agree with what you're saying. There has to be a proper way where in a confidential manner, and we're not talking about pulling officers off the street, but for every person that has that sort of check-in, we're not putting the onus on that person to say this person should not be back on the street. What we're doing is we're saying if this person recognizes that there is traumatic stress or that there isn't, it's an opportunity to present, listen, these are the resources that are available for you. We're reinforcing that sort of education of what is considered sort of a normalcy.
And it's so you start off, which I agree, get them away from their department, keep it completely confidential. That certainly has to be done. But, you know, and I agree. I mean, I agree because you don't want that officer to die by suicide. You don't want the divorce rates. You don't want, you know, the screwed up kids. I mean, there's a multitude. It's not just suicide, but to be able to have the healthiest party. So my thoughts had always been, which is cost prohibitive, is wouldn't it be nice, besides having your battle buddy on the job that we talked about, is to be able to have a culturally competent therapist that you get to see every month from the day you start your academy class to the day you retire. Standard operating procedure. And kind of take this stigma out. The onus of that responsibility of dealing with the mental health, you know, long term becomes that of the clinician. But to me, that was always a great way of being able to kind of make it normal, make it standard, and let somebody else track for an entire career. The issue has always been the finances of that.
I don't think that would be very effective as a therapist, but what I do think would be effective is having a member of a peer support role or a training officer, right? That assigning that battle buddy or whatever you want. You know, in the military, we like battle buddy. We can embrace that. The police officers, that's not a good name. We just need to get a different vernacular to go, yeah, that's acceptable. But if we've got a training officer or a designated person that's designated to mentor that person, that's there to be support to that person, that's got more experience than that, I think that's an amazing idea. And really, if you frame it that way, there really is not any hard costs associated with that.
Yeah, I kind of like a field training officer, a psychological field training officer that kind of gets to follow you through a career until you get to become that mental health.
Exactly. Make it organic where that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
I think we should use the term patrol partner. I think that fits very nicely. I'm going to copyright that when we're done this. I'm going to submit the paperwork. Nobody can take it. I love this. I love this discussion. This is fantastic. Al, what are your thoughts on this whole idea?
Unmute yourself. Oh.
There. Oh, we got to get him unmuted there.
Yep.
Uh-oh. Al, we're losing you. Well, we'll wait for him to get his
While we're waiting for Al, I just wanted to say one thing about what you said when you're talking about a holistic based mentality is needed. Mm-hmm. And just for people out there that don't really understand the sort of holistic essentially means whole body. And we would think that, of course we incorporate the whole body, but primarily in North America, we embrace something that's called the Cartesian model of health. And the Cartesian model of health sees the physical body is the physical body. Thereby, when you need help for your physical body, you go to a physician. The mental is the mental. When you need psychological help, you go to a psychiatrist or you go to a psychologist. And so we've got this sort of breakdown. And what people don't understand is that the physical body can cause psychological injury and problems, and the mental body can cause physiological. So until we get rid of all of this just is another problem. There's a professional jealousy between physical health practitioners and mental health practitioners. They don't see each other as equal. We need to break down that, and we need to incorporate a system and treatment methods that are going to both treat psychologically, emotionally, and the physical body, because they're all intertwined and they're all part of the problem, and that needs the solution has to incorporate all of those things as well.
Al's back, I think, kind of. One of the questions that came up on the we lost him again. Well, one of the questions that came up was something that said FTOs and RTOs are under similar stressors that might make it worse. And then a follow-up that I don't think that as a the trainer approach is sufficient for mental health issues.
I don't think that it should be used as a solution. What I think that should be applied to is just a measurement of sort of an early detection, and just putting that sort of it can't that concept alone is not going to solve this issue. It's not a big enough of a safety net. But what we're looking for is proactive things. What can we do? What can we integrate into what we have now that's not going to cost millions of dollars, that makes it prohibitive? It's not going to take away all of those things, but again, it's just another safety net, another thing that's put into place where a person can sort of have a person to go to if they have a problem, and likewise, that person can kind of monitor that person and say, hey, you know what, Joe isn't himself, or Joe is acting extremely aggressive, or some sort of change in their behavior. And by establishing that sort of relationship, we just add that to our total critical incident stress sort of management strategy that has many different components attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
It also depends on, I think, the hypervigilance of the officer. A lot of times, with peer support, I mean, the road to hell is paved by good intentions. They really don't necessarily trust their own. They are concerned about that. So,
I'm sorry, you said that they really don't trust their own?
Yeah, that when it comes to peer support, throughout the country, depending on where they are and how well known that peer support unit is. There's been
if the peer support people are not frontline officers, absolutely. And if they're not properly trained, absolutely. But I would argue with the fact that if you have a frontline officer that's serving in a peer support role, I do not believe, in my experience, that I've ever seen mistrust based on that. The mistrust is people that are not on that side of the blue wall. When you bring in sort of people sort of on the outside, there's a huge amount of mistrust. And so you know that how much work has to go to get that sort of establish that rapport and get that sort of confidence, because cops don't trust people that aren't other cops.
So one of the things that's been brought up, which I know that you're aware of, is that not all peer support units are created equal, that there is no standard right now throughout the United States of how peer support officers are trained. I've been involved in units where on Monday they're heading up the gang detail unit. On Tuesday, they're heading up peer support. Absolutely no training, not a clue, other than the fact that they're a cop and they can relate.
It's got a nice name to it. That's why. I know in New Jersey, and I don't know if it's still there, but I know like many years ago, there was a very popular program on your East Coast. There was called the Cop to Cop. And this was just another word for sort of peer support, where, they would create these entities. But what people have to understand, you get a police department and they go, okay, we need a peer support program. Who wants to be on it? Okay, there, you're on it. And that's it. Exactly. You have to train these people. You just can't send them out there.
But that's just it. There needs to be a standard, a national standard.
Yes.
Because not everybody can do it. Just because you wore the badge does not mean. And that's where, with Copline, we weed out. We've got brilliant, incredible officers. It doesn't mean that you can answer a call and do that type of work that needs to be done with a peer.
And kudos for that vetting process. I mean, that just gives it more integrity. And no, I think that's truly amazing what you do there.
So being able to do that with peer support is just so needed. And then you're absolutely right. I mean, I think peer support is wonderful. The problem is, and we testified down in DC on this. We're looking at all different issues that were coming up. Peer support was absolutely one of the keys that came up, but then there's no standards. There's no standard process of who gets on the units depending on where they are. And there are some phenomenal units. And without those standards, it's, you can't have the suck up, fuck up, move up theory when it comes to your support.
That's right. Suck it up, Buttercup. And there has to be regular. So let me give an example. I train critical incident stress debriefing teams, peer support teams, when it comes to the Department of Homeland Security. So if you understand the concept of what happens in peer support meetings and critical incident stress debriefings, the reason that there's buy-in and the reason that they are successful is because everything that happens in this is confidential, right? Well, when it comes to Homeland Security, their peer support roles and their critical incident stress debriefings, they have a checklist, and it doesn't matter if somebody says any of these things or whatever, they are required by law to report that to their supervisor. So how many people do you think participate in Homeland Security critical incident stress debriefings? I can tell you how many, at least on some of the states and the people that I've been involved with. There's so many of these things, and so cops, all they care about is their jacket. What's going in my jacket? Is this going to prevent my job? Is it going to prevent me from getting a promotion? Or what are my peers going to think of me? What is my chief going to think of me? We have to incorporate all, and it's political, and it's sad, but it's costing lives. It's costing lives.
No, I agree. I agree. It's just figuring out again. And getting a buy-in that leaves egos, that leaves the finances, that truly takes care of officers. And what we find, so we've got departments throughout the country that on Tuesday they're pumping gas, on Wednesday they've got a gun badge and patch, they're making $12 an hour, they have no representation, and up to a year before they're going to be put through an academy. They're involved in critical incidents. We have no workers' comp. We have no union representing them. We have nothing. We have absolutely nothing. And when it comes to the debriefings, I mean, that's, oh my God, that's, who the hell's going to do that? But to be able to sit back, I mean, and I think sometimes the cop line is just trying to plug in as many holes so that no matter where you are in the country, you've got a peer that's there, that's trained, that gets it, that can at least answer that initial call. And then, part of our resources are exactly this. Do you have peer support? Do you have an EAP program? And obviously, whether it's trusted or what have you, but just trying to get an idea of what's out there to give them additional services if they can. Police chaplains have been another, resource, just being able to do anything that they can connect with.
And it's going to take state and federal regulations. You know what? When you have a person that, has to climb a high thing, there's a law that says I got to wear a safety belt, I got to have a harness. And if they don't, guess what? They get in a lot of trouble and their employer gets in a lot of trouble. Well, guess what? We need some of those regulations federally and in each state to say this is a safety issue. We are mandating that these things have to be put into place to prevent an accident.
So from what I understand, NAPO, National Association of Police Organizations, so NAPO tried to get the workers' compensation issue done federally. It was a bipartisan, not a chance.
No, and the same thing, in Connecticut after Sandy Hook, it went right before the legislature. It was defeated. Because why? It's fear. They are so afraid that, number one, it's going to bankrupt the town, it's going to bankrupt the city, and number two, it's going to be abused. So therefore, we won't entertain that.
And to me, there's no higher threshold than the Sandy Hook, because I think anybody, and if Al can get back on or whatever, what seems to be the international taboo. You guys have amazing gallows humor, not about a kid. It is an international taboo that what can help you kind of decompress or whatever with that gallows humor does not and will not ever exist when it comes to a child-related incident. So to me, Sandy was a threshold that was the easy lift. If there was an easy lift, it was that one.
No, for sure. There's no, when I was in law enforcement, SIDS was so common. And there is nothing in the academy that teaches you how do you tell a mother and father their baby that they did not do anything wrong is dead of SIDS. There's no amount that, number one, can prepare you for how to feel and react in that situation. And then if you're a parent, that drive home after your shift, there's no proper way to be able to deal with that, and this is what the general public doesn't realize. All of these people that have a big hatred for the police, they're seeing such minor isolated incidents where the full story is not shown, whether it's on video or not, and they're not seeing that. They're not seeing the other element. They're not seeing the other element of all of the terrible, tragic things that police officers and firefighters and EMS and military people have to deal with on the daily, not just every once in a while. This is what they do every single day.
But I would hate for the public to think that because they deal with the other, that there's anything going on with, these shootings or what have you. Just that's not the case. That's not a cumulative effect at all. And unfortunately, law enforcement have gag orders, which the public doesn't know. When they say, why doesn't the officer speak out? Well, because they can't. Because unfortunately, he cannot try his case in the media. He has to wait for the.
He certainly tried in the media.
Exactly. But then, the public looks at it as, well, he must be guilty because otherwise, he certainly would have said something. No, like there's gag orders. They can't talk to the media. It's just the level of frustration is truly incredible. And the lack of real information and facts just continues to get in the way of officers getting the help they need, of officers being able to do their job without fear of retaliatory action in all different arenas. And I know that. Go ahead.
One of the things that I think we should look at, I want to talk about two things. That's officers that are sort of stressed out and how to prevent that. And number two, about use of force issues. Number one, I really think that we should look at possibly limiting the duration of what an officer's career is in order to get pension. You know what? Is 20 years too much? And things of this nature. Because if you really look at a person, the average person, if we look at what the definition of a critical incident is, a traumatic experience that was sort of life-threatening, to which they didn't have any control over, whether it was individual, whether it was community, the average person experiences 1.5 to 2 critical incidents per lifetime. The average law enforcement officer in 20 years service is exposed to 800 critical incidents, right? Is that too long? If we're recognizing all of these things now, should we be saying, okay, you know what? Let's look at the capacity. Let's make it more an incentive where an officer can come in and do 10 years and be pensioned, or 10 years of being on the street and gradually being put in a sort of a different role and recognize these things again as a preventative measure.
Or change your fitness and change your hiring processes. Figure out who's a sociopath, give them a gun badge and patch. They can do it for 40 years. They'll be fine.
Jeff made a comment here. He said, political and civilian view is that first responders and law enforcement must be perfect granite guardians with no flaws, mentally, physically, and emotionally. That's something that comes up in a lot of discussions that we have, is that people expect law enforcement to be robots. They're not. They're humans. There's so many interesting things that you guys just brought up. One that I know for sure is when we talk about law enforcement and these critical incidents, people don't understand in the general public. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so if you're watching this, chances are you're in law enforcement, so this is nothing new to you, but you deal with the people on the worst day of their lives most of the time, right? Or in one of the worst days of their lives, right? We used to tell this all the time when I trained hospital staff, security officers that would work like emergency rooms. It's like you really need to exercise some patience and compassion and some empathy when you're dealing with people that are angry and upset, and not take this authoritarian approach, because chances are that person is literally in the worst day of their life right now. Their child was hit by a car, their mom just had a heart attack, whatever it is. They're so emotionally compromised. You trying to be an authoritarian figure on top of that isn't helping anybody. And so when we look at these massive millions and millions and millions of interactions that our officers have, and that such a small percentage actually results in use of force, and an even smaller percentage results in any type of lethal use of force, it's really amazing to me that we don't talk about those numbers more often. That we have so much, if you took the average person off the street and said, all right, this week, I'm going to show you 3 dead bodies. I'm going to have somebody sideswipe your car. And then I'm going to have a person pull a gun on you and expect you not to shoot them. They'd be like, what are you talking about? Like that, like, what do you mean? I can't. And they couldn't even comprehend that. That's a day in the life for a police officer in the United States.
And be a babysitter, and be a marriage counselor, and be a social worker, and all of these things. And again, I'm gonna say this to, especially to the law enforcement officers that are out there, and to the general public. Look at what's going on with the police. This hatred to the police. It's the police's problem. It's not the police's problem. Okay, they are dealing with a problem that they didn't create. Okay. Government created it, and they've just been asked to solve it. Those problems are deep-seated and includes high unemployment. It includes generational poverty. It includes a breakdown in the education system. It includes the lack of an unwritten social contract. All of these things. And because it comes to a boil, what does government say? Oh, we've got crime, or we've got problems with behavior in this particular part of the city. They send the police, okay? That was never the role of the police, and it's not the job of the police. But not only do we send them there and we expect them to solve it, when they don't solve it, and they don't have the resources, they don't have the trainings to do those types of things to solve those problems, who do we hold accountable? The police. It's not the police's fault. And the general public has got to come to an understanding. If you want to fix all of these issues that you have raised to the forefront, who number one created them, and who ultimately is going to be required to provide the resources and take responsibility for solving it.
The responsibility issue, I think, is huge in this country. I mean, we teach our kids, or at least, I taught my kids, you need to be responsible for the decisions you make. You need to be responsible for your actions, what comes out of your mouth, all of that stuff. And then to hold them responsible. I don't know where things got so screwed up. It is everybody else is responsible for what somebody does, for their happiness, for their finances, for their wellness, for you name it. If they're not doing well in school, it's because the teacher isn't teaching properly. And the parents will absolutely advocate for their kids and not hold them responsible.
There's just this aura of entitlement with people today. It's like, it's a combination of that and we've abandoned our absolutes. Right. So, when we grew up, and this is from a social context and from a legal context, there were absolutes. This is right. This is wrong. There was no questions asked. But we're dealing with a generation with every single absolute that's presented to them. They're like, well, you know what? Maybe that's right for this person, but this person shouldn't be held to that same sort of standard. So we're gonna sort of give them a pass. And so you've created now a precedent for basically anything, any rule, any law, if it just comes to the most basic human behavior of what's acceptable and what's not, we now have a generation that doesn't accept absolutes, and at a generation that's entitled. They want everything. They don't want to have to work for it. They want it now, and they want the best of it, and this is a very easy example is I remember my first car. My first car was a piece of crap. I saved a lot of money to buy that first car. But you look at now the generations of people, they don't want a crappy car. They want a brand new car. And they don't want just any brand new. They got to have all the bells and the whistles and things of that nature. Something has happened to us as a culture, and the basic principles that are social values that are ingrained in our educational system at an early age that were designed to make people responsible and to make people accountable. We're seeing that absence and the effect of that.
Jay says in the comments, he said that to educate the public, you need to have an approach that does not come off as a defensive posturing, and we've never done that. We wait for a disaster and then try to explain life. Very true. It's funny you guys say that. I mean, I think we're going down the rabbit hole a little bit off of the mental health topic. I do agree with you both. I agree that this whole participation ribbon culture, I think we've seen what that's caused.
But it does contribute to mental, if you understand, just giving that as a context. Now you add that into the pot. It's extremely frustrating, especially when you get that sort of generation of a person that goes into policing. They're ill prepared. There's a misconception that when they're dealing with an individual, it's like, I'm a good person, I'm a police officer, and I'm telling you to do this. And this person gives them the finger and tells them to F off. All of a sudden they're overcome because they weren't prepared for this sort of conflict, you know?
I'm having a flashback to the conversation I had with Dr. Tracy Kazee on the summit. The very first session that we rolled out, we talked about race in policing. And one of the things that I had mentioned was when we talk about officers, there's a very good chance that an officer will start, and I'm going to use the example of a white officer and a black civilian, just to kind of, that was the context that we had spoken about. But this officer, maybe like they are not in any way, shape, or form racist. Maybe they and for them, they have this opinion of themselves that they're going to go in there and they're really going to try to do the absolute best for their community, and that they have all the best intentions and everything. And they walk into a situation and now they're speaking with this other person, but they don't take into context that person's life and their experience. So they have blinders on to that. So that, because they think that they know that they're there to do good and to help, and they have honest integrity and they want to help that person, but the other person doesn't see that because of their lived experience. So it doesn't matter what that officer does.
Exactly.
That they're never going to meet that expectation with that person.
That's why cultural diversity, and when the rank and file police departments, they hear, oh, I got cultural diversity training. Oh boy, it's so important, because you have to understand people that come from countries, either Canada or the United States, from many other countries. In their countries, many times, police are a very evil entity, number one. And number two, there are just some basic. So when they see you, they don't see you as a person. They don't see you as someone who wants to help. They see what the police in that uniform represented in their home country, which they may have come to Canada, the United States, to escape. But so many social things. There are certain countries where it is perceived very disrespectful for a younger person to look an older person in the eyes. And this was something early in my policing career when I'd be talking to a person from this culture and they're looking down at me, and I'm taking that as sort of disrespectful, like you're just not listening to me, when really what that behavior was socially they were brought up, you don't look an elder in the eyes because that's considered disrespectful. So when you have this training and you have this level of understanding, so that you need to be able to be aware of these things when you're dealing with people from different cultures, is so important. And the community getting involved as one of the stakeholders in solving these problems is also very, very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that we could talk about on a whole nother tangent. We probably need another 3 hours to talk about that topic. What else is there when we talk about officer mental health that we haven't talked about today? I mean, we've covered a lot of different things, but is there anything really, Robert, for you that's top of mind that you're either working through right now with people, or that you see that is something we have to address in the future?
Like I said, you have to have your support mechanisms in place. And one of the things that I said in the ILET summer is, we always see those signs in cases of emergency, break glass. Okay, well, every officer's got to have one of those. And what's underneath that glass? When I find myself in a situation when I'm going to be overwhelmed, what can I do? Who can I call? And put these things into sort of place before something bad sort of happens. And I also encourage people that are involved in policing to find other friends that aren't involved in policing. And that can be extremely difficult. I was at a graduation ceremony a couple of years ago where the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department, he says, this is my advice to you, the sheriff, he just says, make sure that you have friends that have nothing to do with policing, because there are happy stories in policing, but a lot of times they're more tragic and trauma. And when all you talk about is tragic and trauma, that can be very depressing. It can be very sort of disheartening. So you need that balance. It's all about the homeostasis, not only of our body, but there's a mental homeostasis as well. We need to be well-rounded, and we need to have in place these coping mechanisms and things that we are going to use as we're in situations, trauma and stress.
That's something. Sorry, Stephanie, real quickly, just because I want to touch on this before I forget, and I'll let you take off yours. One of the things that you mentioned there was having somebody that's outside, that's in your friend group, that's not in policing. That was something that I didn't realize. Like I said, I was never in law enforcement. All my closest friends were, and so we go out for drinks. And obviously, because I'm in training and I'm interested in what they're doing, I asked them. And it was always, it took me a while to realize, but I was always get these like pained looks on their faces. Like they tell me because they're my friends, but at the same time, I wasn't almost respecting what they wanted, which was for me to be there to not talk about work, right? To talk about hockey, to talk about whatever it was. And then coming to the realization that when we went out to just be bros, like just go out, shoot the shit, have drinks, talk sports, talk girls, whatever it is, and leave all of the work at work. And that was a realization that I came to having friends in law enforcement. And so I think you're 1,000% correct on that, because I've seen it from the other side. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. Stephanie, I'll let you take it off.
I was actually going to comment, and very similar to you as well. It also is like, it helps prevent that like us versus them. Being able to, having civilians is just so important, because there is a different life that you want to make sure that they realize that you can go out, you can, talk about whatever, fishing, you can talk about whatever's going on, and it not have to be so intense, not having to relive whatever you've gone on. I think the ability to just pull that plug is essential.
Unfortunately, I guess you guys have noticed Al hasn't been here for a while. He messaged me. He said, like, my Wi-Fi dropped out. I won't be able to get back on. So we'll make sure that everybody can get a hold of Al. I put the Inner Armor website up on the chat if you guys want to check that out. Obviously, they're located out in the UK, but I think what they're doing is really interesting. And I'm actually going to be working with Inner Armor and with Al on projects moving forward, because, like I said, I think the way they integrate directly into the like as a separate entity that integrates directly into the police forces, that's something that we don't see very often, especially in North America.
Right.
So I want to really see what that looks like and how they're doing it. And maybe it's something that we can actually start implementing here, because I think that would be extremely valuable. Not just having people going and taking a CISM course from Robert, and then going back to their agency as having that officer just go take the training and come back, but actually integrating somebody else into the agency that's there as a resource. Again, though, we talk about budgets, we talk about constraints and all those types of things. There's a lot of hurdles in the North American policing culture that we're going to have to clear before that's a reality.
It's actually what we were just talking about. It's taking somebody that's not law enforcement and being able to put them into a department. It's just one's micro, one's macro, but it is exactly kind of building on that exact same thing. And sometimes the greatest perspective and being able to kind of help is not having somebody who's been saturated in the culture already, but somebody that has, that is not a sworn officer.
And more of these types of forums like we're in right now and the ILET Summit. I mean, Adam, that what you've done is so amazing, because when people understand that, oh, you know what, I can listen to these. They're not after my money. They actually just want to help me. But so many organizations out there appear on the surface to want to help, but at the bottom line, they're in business because they're in business. You know what? My organizations, we're in the business of helping people. We're not in the business, right? And it's very important that when an officer reaches out to an organization, or when a member of the public decides that they're going to contribute funds to an organization, that they look at the integrity of that organization and the leadership of that organization and make a decision to make sure that the money that you're giving is actually going to go to help people, and it's not going to line the pockets of an organization or a person within that org.
Well, we saw that very clearly a few years ago with what happened with Wounded Warriors in the US, right?
Don't get me started on that. I mean, here you had the largest military charity in the United States, and in 2014, they took in donations $750 million. So that's $750 million. Of all of that money, what was spent on veterans? 112 million. 112 million. So where did the rest go? It was squandered.
A lot of nice corporate trips, right? That's
a lot. Open bars, corporate trips.
It was interesting because as that happened, I was still working a lot with Wounded Warriors Canada, and people were like, "Oh, you're," because that was Wounded Warriors Project was a massive headline in Canada as well. But the problem was that those two entities were completely separate. They're not even tied in together in any way, shape, or form other than their name. And people were like, "Why would you support them?" Da, 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 da. I'm like, "No, it's a totally different organization. Like, it's not the same thing." But that's the problem that we find. Exactly what you said is people will jump on a bandwagon, not knowing, and they'll just be like, "Oh, my buddy donated to this, so I'm going to donate." Do your due diligence. At least take a minute and Google. Like, everybody has Google. You have it on your phone. I know we have. I don't know how many, like 70 of those Google pucks around the house that my wife has. So at any point I can be like, "Hey, Google, what's the weather?" Don't use that, right? Use that knowledge that's already created for you to access as humans, and to donate to the correct charity or organization. So I think that's a great point. I think that we don't say that enough to people.
Agree.
All right. Well, listen, we've been at this for 2.5 hours. There's been a lot of discussion. We've talked about a lot of things. And so one of the things that I want to mention before I give you guys kind of a last chance to talk about anything that you want to speak to, and maybe I want to learn a little bit more again about what you guys are doing, Robert, with your groups, and then Stephanie with Copline. One of the things that I want to let everybody here listening to this know is, because of the success of the International Law Enforcement Training Summit, what I'll do is this. And one of the things with all the success is we've actually started a completely new network, and it is going to be called, and I'll bring it up here, is ILET Summits. So this company itself, what it is we are going to be taking organizations and helping organizations and agencies create online events in training for law enforcement, but also for other emergency response groups, and to develop a network of all of these groups together. And so, to kind of put it into perspective, all of us know in law enforcement or military or in emergency response, there's organizations out there. So if you're in law enforcement education training, you may know of ILETA, so the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association. And you may also know of like ILFE, which is the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors. One of the things that you need to know for me is I have so many acronyms bouncing around in my head lately that I may get these confused because there are so many. But the thing is you may be a part of one of these organizations, and even in the US itself, and you're in Northeast, the United States, you may not know of any organizations that are in the Southwest or in California. There may be members of the California Peace Officers Association who don't know anything about NAFTO, which is the National Association of Field Training Officers, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So what we're doing is we're creating an umbrella, a network where all of these organizations are going to be a part of. So if you're a law enforcement officer anywhere in the world and you're interested in instructor development or use of force or firearms training or community development or social media or mass fatality management or public order or mental health, pick your poison. We're going to have resources there for you from the best instructors in the world. And so we're really excited to create this entire network. Now, we haven't really rolled everything out just yet as the time of this recording, which is the beginning of, it'll essentially be the beginning of September right away. when we're going to plan on rolling this out. We're in August right now. So the biggest thing for me is I want to put this thing together for everybody to have access to resources. So the ILET Summit, you're going to see the first event that's coming out that everyone's going to get access to is the National Emergency Responder Conference, which is going to be taking place here in the first week in November. So stay tuned for that. We're going to let everybody in on that. And if you're a member of the ILET Network, the ILET Summit, you're going to get access to that. And vice versa. If you attend that conference, you're going to get access to the ILET Summit. And all of these things that we're putting together, it's all going to be tied up into one nice training bow for you to have access to throughout the year and for years to come. So that's one thing I'm really excited about letting everybody know. We're going to be rolling that out soon. So stay tuned for more information on that. All right. Robert, what's going on in your end of the world? Is there, as far as resources go for officers, is there anything that you want to kind of share? And what are your thoughts on everything we've talked about today?
Well, like I said, what gets me up in the morning is the statistics of police suicide. There is help for these people, so that's what drives me. I'm extremely passionate, extremely aggressive. I'm extremely defensive when it comes to anything that I know that works, and in addressing the things that I know that don't work. So that's very important to me. As you know, I travel back and forth between LA and Toronto. I'm in Toronto for a while. The past 2 days, our community, we lost 2 officers to suicide, actually in the last week and a half. And it's a very, very tragic thing. One thing that I didn't get a chance to bring up too is that you have to understand that police officers in dealing with not only with post-traumatic stress disorder and all these terrible calls or whatever, but is sanctuary trauma, and that is created within the toxic work environment of either their senior command or their peers that are not giving them the support that they need. So so they have such a hard job. I've been working very closely with Badge of Life Canada. And I tell you, if you are a person that wants to contribute to a cause that is legitimate, where no one in that organization gets paid a penny, Badge of Life Canada is the one for you. I'm working very closely. There's a collaborative of many different people that have all of these sort of different techniques. They're different stakeholders, they're different resources, and bringing them together under sort of one umbrella to create this sort of standardized model to be able to help police officers in need, police officers, first responders. So anything that contributes to the general wellness of the individual is something that you're going to find me involved with if I'm here in Toronto or I'm back in LA.
I love it. I love it. Stephanie, what's going on your end of the world?
So I have to tell you, Badge of Life Canada has been awesome with Copline. Just always helpful, forthcoming, what have you, for resources and whatever we've needed. So I want to piggyback on what Robert said. Is what a wonderful, worthy cause. Just want to make sure that we can get the word out there in Canada. I mean, it's so important. We've hit 6 provinces, but lots more provinces out there, and it was really important to us. Our vice president is actually located in British Columbia. Just really important to us to make sure that we got ourselves up in Canada and can do whatever we need to do to help the officers up there. So so stuff that's coming up, we've got a couple. We've got our training coming up at the end of the month, September 30th through October 4th. And we've got our Run for the Call, which will be interesting, but that is probably our biggest fundraiser. It is a 5K that's kind of interesting. That we made a decision to do it at midnight on New Year's Eve. And the decision was made. I just started seeing officers that were really struggling going into New Year's Eve, struggling with sobriety, losses, kind of what's going on, and the reality that officers all over the world are really kissing their loved ones goodbye and not knowing whether or not they're coming home. So, and the unique part about the run, it's run actually in 2 locations. It's run in Carlsbad out in California at midnight, and it's run in New Jersey at Point Pleasant Beach also at midnight. But It's run virtually throughout the country, and we have people that do it on bikes. We have people that do it on ellipticals or what have you, just because of injuries, but they want to participate. But the cool thing is, if they get the information to us early enough and they sign up, is that we will put an officer's name on the back of every single T-shirt. So for those that are kind of runners that run 5Ks or what have you, and you just get that standard shirt, that's not this. And our motto has been, while they were alive, we had their backs, we'll have our backs after they died. And the only thing that we've ever asked for is that they wore the badge with honor. We do not care how they died. So it's just been beautiful to see who's running for whom. We've had people running for canines. We've had people running for parents that that had died many, many years ago. Children, it's the whole gamut. But it's really, really cool to see that person. It's not only their name; it's their rank, it's their department, it's a badge number. So I know I keep my shirts every year because it's just, they're special to me. They're really special to me because those names are picked. So anyway, so that's coming up. That's on our website to sign up, and that's kind of it. COVID did a number on fundraising, but we've been really blessed. We've had incredible calls just like yours, Adam, that you guys were donating. So it made it easy for us to be able to do that, that third training this year, which is what we try and do. So Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, their retiree group, they were wonderful about contributing. The other thing that I really want to get the word out is we need retired officers. We need, people that are going to answer the lines. Like I said, it's no joke. Vetting process is difficult, but I will tell you, those men and women that are answering our lines are truly amazing. And that, when you end up in law enforcement and you end up as part of the canine unit or SCD, whatever it is, that you end up becoming close with those people. Well, think about it. Same thing now is that you have retired police officers from all over the country and Canada that are coming down that all share one goal, and it's to take care of their own and their families. And your partner could be located back east while you're in Texas or what have you for your shift. So would love to encourage retirees. And I always say to people, how when you sign up for shit, it's never exactly what you thought it would be. Well, Copline is exactly what you think it's going to be. And there is no punches. There's no, oh my God, if I only would have known that. Absolutely transparent. The only way we can do this. So that's what we have coming up.
I love it. The run for a cause thing is always a bone of contention with me because I hate running, but everybody always asks me to do them. So I always have to drag my ass out and start running.
You don't even run, I'm telling you, because we've got people on ellipticals. We actually had somebody wake their spouse up to get on a recumbent bike at midnight.
The problem is that I have such a competitive nature that it doesn't matter if I could have like the worst case of COVID you've ever seen. I'd be out there trying to win the race regardless.
Perfect.
That's the problem.
You're it.
Yeah.
Tab. Perfect.
That's awesome. Well, listen, guys, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and expertise with everyone here. It's truly an honor every time I get a chance to speak with you guys and work with you. And there's going to be so much more coming down the pipe that I'm excited. And we're going to keep everybody in the loop with that. So if I can just ask you two to just hang off for a quick second and we'll do a quick AAR when we're done. And just for everybody here, thank you again for attending this session on mental health and awareness for law enforcement. Thank you for attending the International Law Enforcement Training Summit. If you did, thank you for your support. There's going to be a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. And if you're in law enforcement and you're watching this, just be aware that one of the things that we're continually pushing is the agency partner program that we're doing with the ILET Summit, which is essentially an at-cost option that's subsidized by our amazing sponsors that gives all the officers in your agency access to all of the training, the over 70 hours of video training content that we developed for the summit. They get it at cost. So if you have, if it's less than 50 officers, that there's a flat rate of $350. And if it's more than that, it's prorated based all the way down to $5 an officer, and you get unlimited lifetime access to all the training. So please take advantage of that. You can reach out to me directly. You can reach out on the ILETSummit.com website. You can email me, adam@ILETSummit.com, or share it with fellow agencies and fellow officers. And let's try to get this information out to as many people as possible. So thank you all so much for joining us here at the ILET Summit. And make sure to take care of yourself, take care of your partners, take care of your families. And